This is the site of England's greatest historical mystery. 500 years ago, the two young brothers, King Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were brought here to the royal apartments by their uncle to prepare for Edward's coronation. The boys were seen playing in the garden near to this building, the Bloody Tower, or the Garden Tower, as it was then called. Edward's coronation never took place, but their uncle, who bore the same name and title as myself, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned instead. The young princes disappeared from public view. According to the official history of the Tudors and of Shakespeare, they'd been murdered by their wicked, grasping uncle. But historical research reveals that the story is much more complicated than this simple explanation. The hunchback monster that Shakespeare created provides wonderful drama. As history, it leaves a great deal to be desired. 1984 is not only the 500th anniversary of these events, it is also, because of George Orwell, the symbol of the state's potential for control of information, to alter not only the present and the future, but also the past. Is this what the Tudors did to Richard III? Or was he truly a man so corrupted by the pursuit of power that he murdered the nephews he'd promised to support? This programme endeavours to examine this mystery, to penetrate the complications of the historical records, to examine the assumptions, the prejudices, and the beliefs of certain eminent historians, by using the same techniques and methods practiced by the best legal brains in our courts. They have the unenviable task of pursuing the possibilities and probabilities of events in a different age to our own. The witnesses dead and buried, except for their written records. The motives of the authors open to question at every turn. What you are about to see is an attempt to examine objectively the evidence on both sides. Presided over by the distinguished former Lord Chancellor, Lord Elwyn Jones, two eminent QCs will marshal historians and other experts to present the case for and against the King. A jury of 12 men and women will attempt to decide on the guilt or innocence of King Richard III. It should be a fascinating experience. They do so in the knowledge that whatever the outcome, the cells in the tower will remain empty tonight. 500 years ago, the outcome would have been rather different, not only for the accused, but maybe also the witnesses and jury themselves.
Court will rise. The charge is that King Richard III did, in or about the month of August 1483, in the Tower of London, murder Prince Edward, Prince of Wales, and Prince Richard, Duke of York.
Mr. Dillon, I understand that you represent King Richard III in these proceedings.
Lord, I do.
In view of his inescapable absence, what is your plea on his behalf?
Lord, the plea is one of not guilty.
Members of the jury, in these proceedings, you will be invited to deliver your verdict on a matter which has been the subject of fierce controversy and dispute for over 500 years. It is whether or not King Richard III was responsible for the alleged murder in the Tower of London of the two young princes, Prince Edward and Prince Richard. King Richard himself was killed on the battlefield of Bosworth in 1485. He is beyond the power and jurisdiction of this or indeed any other human court. What you are invited to do today in these proceedings is to pass a historical judgment upon him. He stands, in a sense, indicted at the bar of history. The charge against him, as you've just heard, is one of the gravest charges in the calendar of crime, murder. We will, as far as practicable, follow the form of an ordinary criminal trial. However, as the potential witnesses to the events of the year 1483 are long dead, the strict rules of evidence obviously cannot be complied with. You will therefore, in due course, be asked to decide this matter on the basis of probabilities. Is it probable that King Richard murdered the princes or not? May I ask counsel whether that approach to the case is agreed by both?
Lord, it is.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Then, Mr. Russell, do you open the case for the Crown?
Yes, may it please your lordship. Members of the jury, in this case I appear for the prosecution together with my learned friend Mr. Godfrey. And as you appreciate, my learned friend Mr. Dillon appears for the defendant together with Mr. Lott. Members of the jury, in 1483, 500 years ago last April, King Edward IV died, leaving two young sons, the princes, aged 12 and 10. The elder was proclaimed King Edward V, but he never lived to wear that crown. On his way to London to mount the throne, he was taken by his uncle, Richard of Gloucester, this defendant, and incarcerated in the Tower of London, later to be joined, in circumstances which you will hear, by his younger brother, Prince Richard. Within weeks, the defendant had seized the throne for himself, and the young boys, the rightful heirs, shortly afterwards disappeared, never to be seen again. 200 years later, in 1664, their bones were found buried deep within the precincts of the Tower of London and removed to Westminster Abbey, where they lie to this day. The prosecution alleged that whatever the manner of their deaths, whoever actually caused them, they were murdered on the instructions of this defendant, innocent pawns, in a power game which Richard had to win to survive. Now, members of the jury, before I come in the barest outline to the evidence in this case, let me start by setting the historical scene, which I think is necessary. And hopefully you have in front of you a genealogical tree of the houses of Lancaster and York at this time. Your lordship has it?
Yes, and it's in the blue fold.
Thank you. Members of the jury, in the 15th century, England was torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, a civil war between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. Both houses descended from Edward III. And if you look at that tree, you'll see Edward III at the top, and in the centre, you'll find Richard, Duke of York. And you will see that he had three children. Edward, to become Edward IV and succeed Henry VI, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, to become Richard III, this defendant. It was the defeat of Henry VI, far left-hand side, which established not only Edward IV, but the House of York, from which he came, on the throne of England. And thereafter, for the next 10 or 11 years, peace and prosperity reigned up to the period 1483. During that period of time, Richard of Gloucester, the younger brother of King Edward, as you can see, was ruling the north. Edward IV married Elizabeth Woodville, an important character in this drama. The Queen's family, the Woodvilles, were ambitious and acquisitive, and Edward IV turned them into the most wealthy and powerful faction in the south and in Wales, thus, in fact, although he may not have known it, sowing the seeds of the violence and conflict which was to come. Finally, there are two other characters, before we leave this tree, that I must refer you to. Far right-hand side, at the bottom, Henry, Duke of Buckingham, an ally of Richard III, and equally important, left-hand side towards the bottom, Henry Tudor, to become Henry VII and to marry Elizabeth Woodville's daughter, Elizabeth of York. Well, now, members of the jury, let us come now to the death of Edward IV. He died unexpectedly on the 9th of April of 1483, his will nominating this defendant protector to the new child king, aged 12. But despite this, it was immediately obvious that the Woodvilles were determined to seize the reins of power through that boy. Lord Hastings, I'm sorry to keep throwing these names at you, but Lord Hastings, Edward IV's chamberlain and chief of the guard, a very powerful man in the establishment, he realized what the Woodvilles were up to, and he called for Richard from the north. Edward IV had died very suddenly. In the result, Richard, together with his friend and ally, Buckingham, intercepted the king and his Woodville entourage at Stony Stratford on their way to London. Earl Rivers and Sir Richard Grey, leaders of the Woodville faction who were accompanying the boy, were arrested, and the boy king was escorted by the defendant to the royal apartments in the Tower of London, ostensibly at that time to await his coronation, but in fact never to emerge again. The Woodvilles were now in disarray. Their two leaders had been arrested at Stony Stratford, and Edward IV's widow, Elizabeth Woodville, fearing for the safety of herself and her family, took sanctuary in Westminster Abbey with her other children, including young Prince Richard. The defendant then was proclaimed protector by the Royal Council in accordance with the late King's wishes, and the date, June the 24th, was fixed for Edward V's coronation, Prince Edward's coronation. As I said, he was never to come about, because, members of the jury, there seems to be little doubt that by now the defendant had set his sights on the crown for himself. Hastings, who, as I told you, although anti-Woodville, loyal to Edward IV and his son Edward V, wouldn't countenance this. So what happened? What did Richard do? He had him arrested and summarily executed without trial, an act which stunned and appalled not only the establishment in London, but also the populace generally. Rivers and Grey, the two Woodvilles who'd been arrested, were also executed, and the pattern was set, the Crown suggests, the road to the crown by now already running in blood. On the 16th of June, Elizabeth Woodville, the ex-queen, was prevailed upon to release young Prince Richard from the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey on the pretext that his presence was required at his brother's coronation. But he was immediately, having been released, placed with his brother in the Tower. And the prosecution suggests that that was all part of the defendant's scheme to get the young boys together in the Tower so they would both be under his control. What was the next stage, members of the jury? He then set about disinheriting the two princes. He did this by proclaiming them bastards, illegitimate children, upon the basis that before their father, Edward IV, had married their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, he had entered into a contract of marriage with another lady, one Eleanor Butler. The evidence of this pre-contract, as it was known, was said to come from a Bishop Stillington, and if true by the law of those days, that could have nullified Edward's subsequent marriage to Elizabeth. I say if true because the prosecution say it was a pretext, another one. But although it was not generally believed, it helped to clear the princes away from Richard's path to the throne, and indeed, come July the 6th, he was crowned king. The usurpation had been ruthless, smooth, and efficient. But the princes remained a worry, a thorn in Richard's side. Richard was considered a northerner. He'd been up there, as I told you, for many years, and he wasn't popular in the south. His position was by no means secure, there being widespread concern at the way he'd seized the throne. The princes were therefore still a very dangerous rallying point for his opponents, and so, members of the jury, they were brutally murdered. Well, now, why did the prosecution say the princes were killed? Well, members of the jury, to start with, they disappeared and were never seen again. And rumours started in the autumn of that year that they were dead and circulated widely thereafter, both at home and abroad. Did Richard ever produce them to scotch those rumours? No. Did he ever admit that they were dead? No. And why not if they'd died naturally? Did he ever accuse anybody else of being responsible for their murder? No, he did not. He remained silent, totally silent. A thunderous silence, you may think, members of the jury, which in fact shouts his guilt. But, members of the jury, proof of their deaths was established in 1674 when bones, almost certainly theirs, were found buried in the Tower. And, members of the jury, you will want to ask yourselves, will you not, if they were not secretly killed, why were they secretly buried? Members of the jury, before turning to the remainder of the evidence, I will just complete, if I may, the story of Richard's reign. Richard's ally, Buckingham, changed camps and led a revolt against Richard III, this defendant. It was a short-lived rebellion and totally failed. And in the result, Buckingham was arrested and executed. Richard then reigned for another 2 years only. There was a second rising. This time it was actually joined by Henry Tudor and his supporters from Brittany and succeeded in defeating Richard at the famous Battle of Bosworth. Henry Tudor then went on the throne as Henry VII and married Elizabeth Woodville's daughter, joining the houses of Lancaster and York and ending that strife. Members of the jury, the position therefore was this. Those boys, we suggest, could not have been killed in the Tower without Richard knowing. And if he knew, as he must, why did he not bring the culprit to trial unless he was the culprit himself? Now, is this confirmed by contemporary or near-contemporary records? And this is the last matter that I intend to put before you at this stage. The two most reliable records, known as the Croyland Chronicle, which we will be referring to in the evidence, and a record by an Italian called Mancini. One other record to which I must refer, and that is, and probably the best known of them, that of Thomas More in his Life of Richard III. That was written after the event, about 20 years after the event, 30 years actually, I think it was. More describes how Richard first sent a letter to Brackenbury, the keeper of the Tower, ordering him to bring about the deaths of the princes, but when he refused, sent someone else, Sir James Tyrrell, to do the deed. In the result, Tyrrell arranged for 2 servants, Forrest and Dighton, to smother them, and they were buried at the stair-foot, meekly deep in the ground, under a great heap of stone, where, in fact, the bones were found, or near enough. And it is interesting to note that when Tyrrell, who More was suggesting was actually responsible for killing, when Tyrrell was later executed by Henry VII, he was alleged to have confessed to causing the deaths of the two boys. Well, now, members of the jury, that's all I intend to say in opening at this stage. The prosecution alleged and will prove, firstly, the princes were killed in the Tower, that Richard had the motive, secondly. Thirdly, he had ruthlessly killed others on his way to the throne. Fourthly, they could not have been killed without his knowing, but he remained silent and blamed no one else. And finally, fifthly, contemporaneously, he was believed to have been responsible, as recorded by the chroniclers at the time. Try this matter according to the evidence, which, circumstantial and hearsay, though it must be through course of time, we submit that should drive you to only one conclusion on the balance of probability. And therefore, members of the jury, that evidence I will now call before you so that you can, in due course, come to your proper verdict. Mr. Richards, please.
Mr. Dillon, in the circumstances of this case, you may think that the formality, indeed more than the formality, the procedure of taking the oath by witnesses should be dispensed with. Do both counsel agree?
Lord, my learned friend and I have had the opportunity of discussing it. We both agree.
Much obliged. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Richards, your full name, please.
Geoffrey Michael Richards.
And what are your qualifications?
I'm senior lecturer in history at Lancaster University.
Now, I want to ask you straight away about the events following Edward IV's death and leading to Richard becoming king. First, in a sentence or two, would you summarize your interpretation of those events?
I think the whole thing has to be seen in the context of the factional struggles which had split England in the late years of Edward IV and in the reign of Edward V. Richard moves to become protector in order to secure his position against his enemies. And when that proves to be insufficient, he moves to become king to further secure his position. And to maintain that position, it's necessary for him to dispose of his principal threat, the princes. And I think that throughout one can see running through all his actions a continual thread, and that is fear and hatred of the Woodville clan.
What was the power of the Woodvilles? How had they achieved this power?
Through the marriage of Elizabeth to Edward IV, as a result of which he built them up with land, titles, positions, until they'd become a deeply entrenched factional interest. And by the time Edward IV died, and shortly thereafterwards, they were in direct control of the court, the council, the Tower of London, the King's treasure, the fleet, and what is most important of all, the two princes. And it was through the two princes that they hoped to rule England.
And I think I'm right in saying they'd brought up, the relatives of Elizabeth Woodville, the mother, had brought up the Prince Edward and Prince Richard.
Yes.
In the West Country and Wales.
Edward, Prince of Wales, had been brought up at Ludlow by his uncle Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, Ludlow being the administrative headquarters of the Principality of Wales. Yes. And Richard, Duke of York, had been brought up by his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, at court. So to all intents and purposes, these two boys are Woodvilles.
What had happened immediately after Edward IV's death in relation to the Richard's protectorship of the new boy king?
The council had met, the royal council, and dominated by the Woodvilles, had vested regency powers in the council itself and had not appointed Richard as protector, and this clearly gave substance to his fears that he was going to be outmanoeuvred.
Lord Hastings, who I was telling the jury was Lord Chamberlain and Captain of the Guard, very powerful man, correct?
Lord Hastings was a pivotal figure at court, a pillar of Edward IV's court and also of Edward V.
Pro-Edward, but anti-Woodville?
Very strongly. He'd had two long and well-publicised feuds with key members of the Woodville clan.
Did he summon Richard to come south and assist?
He urged him to come as soon as possible to take possession of the king and assert his protectorship.
And as I don't think there can be any dispute about this, this was done at Stony Stratford by Richard and Buckingham.
Yes, Buckingham was...
Rivers and Grey, the Woodville escort, being arrested.
Yes.
How did Prince Edward react to that? The arrest of his uncle and half-brother, was he?
Yes, his half-brother.
Yes.
Gloucester and Buckingham explained why they'd done it, and they said that the Woodvilles were plotting against Richard and trying to deprive him of the protectorship. And Edward replied that he'd found no fault in his relatives and wanted to keep them with him.
Yes. Now, I think the result of the arrest of the Woodvilles was that the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen, took the rest of her family into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey.
That's right.
Can you tell us in a sentence, Mr. Richards, what sanctuary was?
All churches were able to give a measure of protection to fugitives from the law for a certain amount of time. Some religious establishments, notably Westminster Abbey, were able to give permanent protection to fugitives.
So she should have been safe, though?
In theory.
On May the 10th, I think, the Council then confirmed, after the Woodvilles had been disposed of, the Council then confirmed Richard's protectorship.
Unanimously.
Coronation fixed for June the 24th.
Yes.
Was Richard now secure?
No, Richard wasn't secure
Why not?
because the Woodvilles were still alive, even if temporarily dispersed. Edward V had expressed his partiality for them, and Richard will not have been unaware of the fact that the two previous Dukes of Gloucester, both of whom had exercised power during the youth of their royal nephews, had both been disposed of once those nephews had come of age and taken power, and Richard must have feared that if he carried on as protector and gave up when Edward V came of age, which he could do at 15, he might very well be for the high jump, because the Woodvilles would come back into power.
Yes. So what did he do?
Richard asked the council to condemn for treason and execute Rivers and Grey.
Who had been arrested at Stony Stratford and were being kept in custody somewhere.
In Richard's castles in Yorkshire.
Did the council agree to that course?
The council not only didn't agree, but they expressed disquiet that the king's chosen advisers should be kept under guard.
And so what is your interpretation of what happened then?
I think that this triggered Richard's desire to go for the throne. He couldn't be secure merely as protector, because the council wouldn't back his desire to get rid of his principal enemies.
I think there's evidence from one of the chroniclers, Mancini, I think it is, that Buckingham then sounded out those in the establishment as to what view they would take of that course.
Yes, Buckingham was the intermediary, and he sounded out, first of all, and most importantly, Lord Hastings.
Yes.
If he would accept Richard as king, and the answer clearly was that he would accept Richard as protector, but not as king.
And what happened to Hastings in the result?
Richard called a council meeting to the Tower, at which he arrested and summarily executed Hastings and imprisoned those other leading members of the council whom he thought would have supported Edward V.
What was the reaction to that?
A shock of horror through the entire establishment, because this was an unprecedented act to execute a major councillor in peacetime, and not only that, but the citizenry were also dismayed because of Hastings' popularity as a general benefactor.
Keeping the matter chronological, on June the 10th, Richard wrote the letter to York asking for troops.
Yes, I have that letter before me if you'd like me to read it.
Well, just read the relevant part, would you?
To come to aid and assist us against the Queen, her blood adherents and affinity, who have intended and daily do intend to murder and utterly destroy us and our cousin the Duke of Buckingham and the old royal blood of this realm.
Yes, very well.
What was the date of that again?
June the 10th, 1483.
Thank you.
And I think they arrived shortly before the coronation.
They did. The point was to threaten people with the arrival of this vast horde of Northerners and to cow London by the threat of their imminent arrival.
June the 16th was Prince Richard, well, I won't use a word which might be indicating a suggestion to you, was Prince Richard, was he released, let's use a neutral word, released from the sanctuary in the Abbey?
Yes, he was. Richard had now cowed the council, who were afraid of suffering the same fate as Hastings, and so they agreed to a delegation going to ask Elizabeth Woodville to release Prince Richard for the coronation of his brother.
Was that a good reason or a pretext, do you think?
A total pretext, as far as I'm concerned.
Why?
Because he wanted to get Richard, Duke of York, who was the heir to the throne after Edward V, into his power and into the Tower before he could move to secure his own position as king.
Well, now, having got Richard from sanctuary and into the Tower with his brother, the proclaimed king, was his position then secure?
No, his position then still wasn't secure, even after he'd become king, because they then represented a potent focus for rebellion and revolt. And this was the reason that every other previous medieval monarch who deposed a predecessor liquidated that predecessor for fear that they would provide a focus for rebellion in the kingdom.
That had happened, had it?
That had happened. Edward II was deposed by his wife Isabella, the she-wolf of France, and liquidated at Berkeley Castle. Henry IV disposed of Richard II under very similar circumstances when rebellion was brewing, and Henry VI had been done away with by order of Edward IV.
So the rebellion, that arose at what time thereafter?
Richard's spies reported to him in the summer that rebellion was brewing.
What was the reason for the rebellion, initially?
The reason for the rebellion was to free the princes from the Tower.
Then what happened?
Richard's spies had reported to him, according to the Croyland chronicler, who was a well-placed government figure, that the rebellions were brewing to free the princes from the Tower and to free the princesses from sanctuary. Now, we know from the Croyland Chronicle that Richard took steps to make sure the princesses couldn't get out of sanctuary by ringing it with steel. And the logical corollary of that is that at that point he liquidated the princes so that there could be no chance of them providing this focus for rebellion.
Were there rumours at that time that the princes were dead?
Rumours spread shortly thereafter that the princes were dead, but it was not known how.
Where did the rumours circulate?
I think if we can use Whitehall parlance, sources close to Richard III.
That's the old Fleet Street parlance.
I beg your pardon.
Yes.
And did the revolt then...
Called usually reliable, I think.
What I think you're saying is that, first of all, there was the revolt to free the princes. Then, when there were rumours that they were dead, and in the result, the revolt then was to support Henry Tudor.
After he had married Elizabeth of York, yes.
After he'd married, and had there been an arrangement that that should happen?
The arrangement was negotiated between Henry Tudor's mother and Elizabeth Woodville in Sanctuary.
Elizabeth Woodville in Sanctuary had arranged for her daughter to marry Henry Tudor.
And for them to take the throne together.
Would she have ever done that, do you think, if she had not appreciated that her other two sons in line for the throne were dead?
It's inconceivable, in my view, that she would have done so.
Well, now the position was that the rebellion was brought under control very quickly and Buckingham defeated and executed, Buckingham having changed camps.
Buckingham joined very late in the day when all this was well underway, but the rebellion collapsed quickly and he was executed.
Was Richard now secure?
Richard was now secure, and this is demonstrated by the actions which followed this. In early 1484, he negotiated an agreement whereby Elizabeth Woodville came out of Sanctuary with her daughters, and he also offered pardons to two of the principal Woodvilles, the Marquis of Dorset and Sir Richard, who'd been leading rebels and whom previously he'd made every effort to capture. He was now willing to pardon them, the key fact being that the Woodvilles' key to power was possession of the princes, and since the princes had been put out of the way, the Woodvilles had no way of supplanting Richard.
Well, now, lastly, Mr. Richards, you've told us that how Richard had dealt with Hastings, Rivers and Grey. You've told us about Richard's motive. You've told us that no previous monarch in his position had ever behaved any differently. One final matter. Richard apparently remained totally silent when these rumours, having started in the autumn of 43 and continued thereafter, remained totally silent. How do you read that?
It's very curious because he made very strenuous efforts to deny rumours circulating that he intended to marry his niece Elizabeth of York. And the fact that he didn't bother to deny these very abundant rumours, both at home and abroad, seems to me to point to his guilt.
If anybody else had done it without his condoning it, is there any way that he would not have been informed of that?
Absolutely not, because the Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Robert Brackenbury, was one of his most devoted followers.
And was there any reason, if he had known that somebody else might have done it for some other motive, was there any reason for him not to accuse that person?
None.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Richards.
Still cross-examined. Mr. Dillon?
Very pleased, Your Lordship. Mr. Richards, part of your evidence is clearly based upon such sources as we have close to the time that we're having to consider, which is 4 months in the year 1483. It's notable, I think, that you have referred to some of those sources, Mancini and Croyland in particular, about which I think the next witness is in fact going to be giving evidence, but you have not at all referred to Sir Thomas More.
No.
Do I take it that that is, if I may express it broadly, in this way because you accept the opinion of Professor Ross, who is the Professor of Medieval History at Bristol University, I think.
He is, yes.
Can I quote the passage to you? More's highly elaborate account of the death of the princes has long ago been dismissed as contradictory and deserving of nothing but scepticism.
I don't entirely share that view, no. I think that More is very interesting, but problematical. And he's problematical in two ways. Firstly, because he's writing from the context of the court of Henry VIII. And secondly, because he's writing in a literary style and form different from the chronicles which I have used. As a humble medieval historian, I don't presume to trespass on the territory of Tudor court historians, and I think you may well be hearing evidence from one of our most distinguished Tudor court historians about how one places this in context. I don't think one should dismiss More out of hand. There are a number of interesting things in More, but I don't think I myself need to add more to the sources which I've adduced to convince myself that Richard was guilty.
What would you say to this statement that More is full of provably false facts and is too discredited to build on?
No, I don't think that is so. I think it depends on what you think.
Forgive
More...
me interrupting,
Sorry.
Mr. Richards, for time presses upon us. You do not accept that statement?
No.
I take it
Not
from a
entirely.
statement, sir, which you have provided for my learned friend for the prosecution. They are your own very words that I have in typing before me.
Can you repeat them?
Certainly, with pleasure.
Yes.
It is, meaning More's account, written in about 1513, so 30 years after the event and not intended for publication, we are led to believe. It is full of provably false facts and is too discredited to build on.
Yes, well, I wrote that at an early stage in my researches, and since then I've reread More, and I don't stand entirely by that as I did. I mean, I think there are, as I say, difficulties and problems with More.
Is one of the factors that one's got to bear in mind when reading More that he was brought up in the household for a considerable period of Morton, then Bishop of Ely, later to be made Archbishop of Canterbury by Henry VII?
He was brought up in that household, yes. But,
is that one of the factors that one has got to bear in mind when one comes to read Sir Thomas More's account of the life of Richard III?
I think it is, yes.
Mancini is a source upon whom you have relied. Mancini said of Morton that he was a man of great resource and daring, for he had been trained in party intrigue. Has a modern ring, those words, has it not?
It's the whole argument I've been putting
Since
forward.
Henry VI, but I am asking you about Mr. Morton.
Yes?
Yes. Would you agree with that statement?
He was an accomplished party intriguer, yes.
Thank you very much. Well, now, let me deal, if I may, very shortly, and I dare say very inadequately, Mr. Richards, for I cannot cover the whole spectrum, with some of the facets that you have touched on and some that you have not yet mentioned at all. Would you accept from me that by the 9th of April, 1483, the date of Edward IV's death, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, whom I defend, then 31 years of age, had shown himself to be a good man. I use that layman's word deliberately. Good in relation to the common people, good in relation to his family and his position of state.
Ruthless in his carve-up of his states to build up his power, too.
Anything else that you wish to add? I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Sorry.
Anything else that you wish to add to that catalogue?
As I say, ruthless in his carving up other people's estates, including those of his mother-in-law, in order to benefit himself.
Well, I don't know how one should act in relation to the estate of one's mother-in-law, of course. Anything else you wish to add to that?
I'd be disinclined to lock her up for life, which is what he's alleged to have done.
That's precisely what Henry VII did with his mother-in-law, Elizabeth Woodville, in due course, isn't it?
That's debated. She may well have retired to Bermondsey Abbey through ill health, it is said. But again, you have to consult Tudor historians, I think, on these matters, rather than, as I said, humble and increasingly discredited medieval historians.
I thought Richard died before the end of the medieval period.
The the terminology of periods is a matter that's in dispute between
Let us not
historians.
waste time upon that, perhaps, Mr. Richards. And let me turn then to another detail, for I shall call evidence upon Richard's status. He had, would you agree with me, at any rate this far, shown himself totally loyal to his brother Edward IV, therefore totally loyal to the crown.
Totally loyal to his brother Edward IV, so far, but not loyal to the crown under Edward V.
Please, of course, add anything you wish in your answer. Let's go on from the 9th of April. The first thing that Richard did was to summon the lords and nobles of the north, for he was a northerner and identified very much as a northerner by those in London and the south, to a requiem mass in York Minster, requiring that those who attended immediately undertook an oath of fealty to the new king, Prince Edward.
That's so.
Came to London to undertake the post which had been imposed upon him by the will of his brother, namely as protector to the infant prince.
Though that will had been set aside by the decision of council to vest the regency powers in itself.
Yes, that council then reversing that decision immediately after his arrival.
And after
on the 10th of May.
And after the dispersal of the Woodvilles, who had been the dominant factor on that council.
Of course, one has to bear all these factors in mind. He was advised by Hastings, was he not, to seize the prince on his journey, for to secure the prince would be to secure himself.
That's right, yes.
It's right to give full weight to that fact, for it was the advice that Hastings gave him, a fact mentioned in Mancini, not alas, however, in Croyland.
Hastings believed that that was what was necessary, yes.
After his arrival, he continued to act, having been appointed protector, in the interests of the king-to-be, Edward V, requiring acts of fealty to be undertaken by those in London towards the king, and undertaking the first steps towards the coronation, which one would expect. To begin with, Edward was placed in the palace of the Bishop of London, close by St. Paul's. The council resolved that he should be placed in the Tower, which is not the Tower as we understand it today. It was the premier royal household with many buildings around what we now see as the Wall. It was traditional at that time that the king should travel to his coronation from the Tower.
It was a royal palace at the
Indeed.
time. I see.
Indeed. It was the premier royal palace of England, was it not, Mr. Richards?
I guess you could call it that, yes.
It would be traditional, of course, that members of the king's family, the king-to-be's family, should travel with him from the Tower.
Yes.
Thank you. Between then, and we're now to the end of May, really, at high speed, and the 13th of June, comes that letter to which you have referred, of the 10th of June, written to the Mayor of York, in fact.
Yes.
Written by Richard, describing himself as the brother of kings and the uncle of kings, so that he was maintaining that same attitude as the protector throughout, calling upon assistance from the mayor and the notables of York, for he had identified the Queen, her affinity and adherents, as plotting against him and Buckingham. And if one reads the letter, it is clear that he is asking for assistance, for he fears not only the destruction of himself and Buckingham, but also the interest that he represented, namely the North. That's correct, is it not?
Yes.
Powerful support for Richard's fear has recently been uncovered, only in 1980, in fact, by a fragment in the Royal College of Arms. Do you know the one to which I refer?
No, you'll have to refresh my memory.
MS2, M6.
You'll have to refresh my memory.
May I read the relevant passage to you? There's a reference to Buckingham in it as well. In the meantime, there was divers imagined the death of the Duke of Gloucester, that's Richard, the defendant, and hit was espied. I have to read the words as they existed. It means that it was found out, does it not? And the Lord Hastings was taken in the Tower and beheaded forthwith. The manner of his beheading can be criticised, but within that there may truly be a reason for his beheading.
As soon as the tumult started in London following the beheading, Richard sent out heralds to announce that there had been a plot, but there is no evidence for a plot. And you say the manner of the beheading, but there was no trial. I mean, that's criticism of the beheading.
I fully appreciate the latter, but within that, and that fragment, as I stress again, only came to light in 1980, one finds corroboration of Richard's genuine fear. Does one not?
The document to which you refer, as I now recall, are the commonplace books of a London merchant. And he was recording the sort of views that were current in London. But the Croyland Chronicle, which I believe is the work of, or based on the memoirs of Bishop Russell of Lincoln, who was a prominent figure in the government, says that, that innocent blood was shed and there was no trial, no judgment, and that Hastings, in effect, was not guilty.
Two views, to be balanced, here as in so many parts of this matter.
I'd be inclined to give more weight to somebody who was at court and was a government minister rather than a citizen picking up gossip.
So I understand you to say. One last matter, can I just understand, if I may, please? The time of the release of the daughters, which is February and March of 1984, that's the daughters of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, who were in sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, was after Henry VII had attempted to join Buckingham in the uprising in October 1483, after it was rumoured that the princes were dead, and when the finger might have pointed at either Richard or possibly at Buckingham, or possibly at both, and after Henry VII had sworn on Christmas Day, I think, in Rennes Cathedral.
That's right.
To strive for the throne of England and undertaken to marry Elizabeth. Elizabeth does not... Elizabeth is the eldest daughter of Edward IV.
That's right.
So it was in those circumstances that Elizabeth Woodville surrendered Elizabeth Tudor, Elizabeth Woodville, her daughter, to the power of Richard of Gloucester.
That's
now Richard III.
Yes.
Very well.
Because she was a canny old political bird, and she knew she needed to survive.
Don't you like Elizabeth Woodville very much, do you?
Not a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Richards. Dr. Ross, please.
Thank you.
Dr. Jean Ross, I think it's right that you're senior lecturer in anatomy at the Charing Cross Hospital Medical School.
That is correct.
Lord, before I ask this witness to tell us her conclusions in relation to the bones, there is a matter of agreement which I think will save time and which my learned friend and I have discussed. It relates to the finding of the bones and the statement which I think Mr. Dillon will accept is this, that in 1674 two sets of bones were found by workmen in a chest buried under a staircase in the White Tower in the Tower of London. I can let your lordship have a copy of this if necessary.
Thank you very much.
they were assumed to be those of the princes and removed to Westminster Abbey. In 1933, they were disinterred for an examination by two experts, Mr. Tanner, the keeper of the monuments of the Abbey, and Professor Wright, who was then, this is 1933 of course, president of the Anatomical Society of Great Britain. Sure. And Dr. Ross, I think it's right that you've had an opportunity of seeing and examining Professor Wright's report on his examination of the bones in 1933.
I have.
You had an opportunity, I think, of not only seeing Professor Wright's report, but also examining photos of the bones.
Taken by Professor Wright.
Taken
yes.
by Professor Wright. First of all, Dr. Ross, would you give us your two conclusions?
I concluded that the ages of the bones at the time of death were consistent with 12 and 10 years, which were the approximate ages of the princes, and that there was some evidence that they were blood-related.
First of all, I don't think you could tell what sex.
No.
And I don't think Professor Wright ever suggested he could either. Did you examine from photographs taken by Professor Wright and from his description, were you able to consider the elder and younger boys' teeth and jaws?
Yes, I was.
What did you find in relation to the eldest boys insofar as age was concerned?
The teeth showed that he was at least 12 years old and certainly not more than 14.
Which would accord with Edward's recorded age.
That's right.
And the younger?
He was at least 9 and not more than 10.
Again, which would accord with Richard's
That's
reported age. Now, in relation to blood relationship, your second conclusion, I think there was a missing tooth, an upper premolar, in Edward's jawbone.
On both sides.
And a missing milk tooth in Richard's lower jawbone.
That is
When
right.
we say missing, never there at all.
Never there at all.
Yeah. Is that unusual?
Very unusual for these particular teeth.
And in addition, what did that indicate to you, therefore?
A similar anomaly, if we may call it that, in the two boys would indicate that they were possibly blood relations.
And I think there were missing teeth also in another young woman who died about that time, aged 8½. In fact, Richard's wife, Anne Mowbray.
That is right.
Was she a distant relation?
Yes, she was.
She had missing teeth as well.
She had very unusual missing teeth, similar to those of Edward's.
So it would appear to be a family trait.
That is right.
And finally, did you examine both the skulls? I think I need only ask you this. Did each of the skulls have a little extra island of bone at the back of both sides?
That is right.
Is that unusual?
That is unusual too.
Would that also indicate there was a blood relationship between the two skulls?
Possibly. Possibly.
On purely anatomical grounds, what would your conclusion be?
That the bones were consistent with being those of the princes, and that they very possibly were.
Suffocation, blood stain on the skull, as found by Professor Wright. Do you go along with that, Dr. Ross, in any way?
No, bones would not be stained by blood in that way, and indeed Professor Wright himself tried to test the stains for blood and was not able to prove it.
Thank you very much.
So we have no clue to the cause of death.
None.
In respect to these young people.
No.
It's most unfortunate, but in fact the president of the society's conclusion, that's Mr. Wright's, that there was a blood stain on the lower jaw simply cannot be supported.
No, it cannot.
And secondly, as you've made clear, his further conclusion, which would, if it was right, have corroborated Sir Thomas More's account of the death of the princes, namely that they had been suffocated, his further conclusion that the presence of the blood stain lends support to suffocation cannot again, alas,
No.
be accepted at all.
Not at all.
So that the view which has been current since his examination of the bones in 1933 on those two aspects alone has to be laid on one side now.
I'm afraid
completely. We cannot, as things remain, date the remains at all.
No.
All one can say about it, doing the best one can, is that they are to be dated sometime prior to 1674,
Yes.
which is the date that we are told they were found.
That's right.
Secondly, the best thing that we can do is to say that they are the bodies of children, because one cannot even sex them. One can't tell whether they're boys or girls.
Not from the remains that are there, no.
Well, then let me ask you about Professor Bradford, who I understand to be a professor in dental surgery in Bristol, who expressed the opinion, examining the same material that you have, i.e. not the original material, but only Professor Wright's report, that the elder child was not more than 11 if one assumes the child's average development. Now, what we cannot do, alas, in the 20th century is to know a great deal about the average development of a child in the 15th century, can we?
Well, it happens that as far as the teeth are concerned, there is some evidence as to the development of the dentition.
If you please.
From Anne Mowbray's skeleton, a very extensive examination was made of her teeth, and it was established that they knew her age at death, and the state of her dentition exactly corresponded with her age, as we would have expected it to be today.
But that applies to a female child, and not the child under examination, doesn't it? Must do. Well, then, I'm just going to ask one final question. I understand it to be the opinion also by Professor Bradford, not much credence can be attached to the evidence of consanguinity. Would you like to comment on that remark of his?
I don't know whether he knew of these anomalous teeth.
Well, he knew as much as Professor Wright knew.
Professor Wright didn't know about the anomalous teeth because they were not described until 1965, I think.
Thank you.
Is there any difference in the speed of development of the teeth of a female child as distinct from a male child?
They are perhaps 6 months in advance of the male, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. Dr. Pollard, please. Dr. Pollard, I think you're a principal lecturer, or the principal lecturer in history at Teesside Polytechnic.
Well, I'm only one of them, as a matter of fact. There are quite a few.
All principals?
No, lecturers.
Good.
Dr. Pollard, I want to come straight away to ask you about some of the contemporaneous chroniclers at the time of the Richard's accession. Which of the chroniclers do you principally rely upon?
Well, undoubtedly Mancini and Croyland, the two most contemporary
Well, then
ones.
let me ask you about those. Mancini first. Was he an Italian cleric who was in London at the relevant time?
Yes, that's so.
I think he was there for about the first 6 or 7 months of 1483.
Yes.
Briefly, what was he doing in London?
Well, he'd probably come on an intelligence-gathering mission sent by a close associate of Louis XI of France.
So he was well connected.
Yes, he did have important connections in England.
I think he subsequently wrote an account of those 6 months, the account of what he appreciated happened in London at that time.
Yes.
But that account was not discovered until 50 years ago, I think, 1934.
Yes, that's true. It came to light in Lille at that time. The account was actually written before the end of 1483. It was written by the 1st of December. And the important thing about it, and the impact of its discovery 50 years ago, is that, of course, up to that time, everyone had been able to say, well, the hostile views of Richard III came from people who were writing after the Battle of Bosworth. Here, for the first time, was a good, coherent account written well before Bosworth.
He was an Italian, and did he have any grasp of the English language?
Not a lot, we understand. He, of course, spoke Latin, and as I hope I'll show, he mixed with people who were his own countrymen, who spoke English and also spoke, obviously, Italian to him.
He has been described, I think, by Mr. Potter, the chairman of the Richard III Society, as a man of integrity and an honest reporter. Do you agree with that?
Yes, a very sound judgment by Mr. Potter.
What sort of sources do you think he had?
Well, we know for a start that he had contacts in Edward IV's court and also later on in the household of Edward V. In particular, Dr. Argentine, the king's physician, a man, of course, who had inside information about what was happening around Edward V. This was a vital contact for him. He also, I think, would have been able to talk to fellow Italians in London, Genoese merchants, we're pretty certain, and generally people in London.
In relation to the princes themselves, does he record very early in the introduction to this record, does he indicate Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who shortly after destroyed Edward's children?
Yes, those are the words.
And does he also refer in another place, this is the end of chapter 5, my lord, to men bursting into tears? What's that reference?
Well, he tells us that he observed people himself in the streets of London bursting into tears when they thought and contemplated about the fate awaiting, particularly Edward V.
And he ends up with the words, I think, already there was a suspicion that he had been done away with. Whether, however, he has been done away with and by what manner of death, so far I've not at all discovered.
Yes, that's a very good example of his honesty. He admitted that he hadn't been able to find out exactly what had happened, though he suspected very strongly.
Does he also refer to in the course of this story, to the death of Hastings?
Yes, he does.
Referring to the Protector rushing headlong into crime.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think there's a further quotation which starts, "Thus fell Hastings."
Yes, killed, it's a very nice one, killed not by those enemies he'd always feared, but by a friend he had never doubted.
Yes, very well. Well, now, turning to Croyland, please. I think that was a chronicle written in 1486.
Yes,
Do we know who the writer was?
Probably Bishop John Russell of Lincoln.
A very well-connected person.
Yes, he had been, in fact, Chancellor for Richard III. That's the sort of chief minister of the Crown.
Now, I think it's correct that he does nowhere in that record directly accuse Richard.
No, he does not.
But does he quote from a poem in the course of his writing?
Yes, there's a strange little poem right at the end of his account in which he states that Richard III destroyed his brother's progeny.
And what interpretation do you put upon the fact that he included that and that particular poem in his record of these events?
That he was the cause of his nephew's ruin.
Destroyed his brother's progeny goes a little further than that.
Well, I think many people would argue that, yes.
Yes, I see.
At that time, when I say at that time, I think to be precise, on January the 15th, 1484, did the French Chancellor make an observation in public?
Very similar kind. The Estates General of France had met then. He said the children of King Edward were killed with impunity and the crown transferred to their murderer.
And Philip Comines, I think a French historian, a writer of European history at that time,
yes,
does he accuse both Richard and Buckingham
of
being a party to this matter?
He tells us that Richard barbarously murdered his nephews, and he also says that the deed was actually done by the Duke of Buckingham on Richard's orders.
Well, now, the other matter about which I want to ask you is the question of pre-contract. First of all, and if you can, simply in just a sentence or two, Dr. Pollard, what was the position of a pre-contract of marriage by canon law?
Well, I think it's been well established fairly recently that there are two basic kinds of pre-contract that we're talking about. One is simply when a man and woman become man and wife by simple exchange of vows and a statement saying, "I do marry you." In effect, what takes place in the church service today. The other, and the one I suspect which is relevant in this case, is a promise to marry is made. And it is significant in this respect, once a promise is made. If the couple then nip into bed, then I think it is said that the marriage is a genuine one that has taken place. So sexual intercourse has to follow the promise.
Yes, and then it becomes a valid contract.
Then it becomes a valid contract.
Yes. Now, what were the facts here? Again, if you could outline them very shortly to us.
Well, I think we here must refer to the titulus regis. Now, that's the formal Act of Parliament which laid down Richard's claim to the throne, where he put down strictly for the record what the situation was as he wished to say it was. And in this document he says, Edward IV was pre-contracted to Eleanor Butler, that therefore, the marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid. Therefore, the sons of that marriage, the princes, were bastards. Therefore, they could not inherit the throne. And thus, he, Richard, held the title because his elder brother, the Duke of Clarence, had been attainted and there was no one else between him and the throne.
When you say his elder brother had been attainted, Clarence, I think, had been accused of treason.
That's right.
And therefore, in that way, had been disinherited.
That's right.
So between the princes, between Edward IV, after Edward IV, Richard was the proper king.
Yes.
Now, what I really want to ask you is this. This suddenly arose in the middle of June of 1483.
Mm-hmm.
Had anybody ever made this suggestion before?
No.
That there had been a pre-contract and therefore the Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville's marriage was invalid?
Not this specific
Do we
thing.
know where the source of this suggestion came from in June of 1483?
Well, we know from Commune that it was Bishop Robert Stillington.
That's Philip Commune, who you mentioned
the
before.
man we've just mentioned, yes, who was Bishop of Bath and Wells. And in fact, that's confirmed by record sources of 1485.
That Bishop Stillington was the source of this information.
Yes, that is right.
Having been a witness to the pre-contract.
That is right. He says he was the only witness.
Well, now, I think what happened was that on the 22nd of June, the two princes having been placed together in the Tower on the 16th of June, I think I'm right in saying.
Yes.
And the coronation of Richard being 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, on the 6th of July. On the I think it was the 22nd of June, was it not, that a priest, Dr. Shaw,
yes,
preached at St. Paul's Cross,
yes,
the bastardy of these princes?
Yes.
And was that accepted?
Yes, people did accept it.
But do we find that Mancini says that these matters having been raised, that he sought the crown for himself? On hearing this, the lords consulted their own safety, warned by the example of Hastings, perceiving the alliance of the two dukes, Richard and Buckingham, whose power, supported by a multitude of troops, would be difficult and hazardous to resist.
Yes. I think it could be said that the Duke of Buckingham and Richard made them an offer they couldn't refuse.
So finally, Dr. Pollard, I think the position was this. You say there was, upon the basis that this pre-contract was genuine or a pretext?
A pretext.
What should have happened legally?
Well, the facts of the case concerning matrimonial law should have gone to an ecclesiastical court.
Did Stillington ever give evidence anywhere?
There's no record that he was ever examined by anybody.
And did Mancini and Croyland, from the two quotes you've already given us, did they appear to believe it or not?
Well, neither of them did, and I think we've seen the way that Mancini didn't. The Croyland chronicler quite bluntly calls it this colour for this act of usurpation. He tells us he believes it was a bill invented in the north, and he goes on to suggest that the Duke of Gloucester was the sole mover of what he describes as these seditious and disgraceful proceedings.
And lastly, this, upon the basis of whether it was genuine or a pretext. Even if it was technically an invalid marriage because of a pre-contract, could Parliament at any time have reversed it and thereby legitimised the children again?
Yes, it could have done, and of course it was to do so subsequently under Henry VII.
So as soon as Henry VII deposed Richard at Bosworth, he reversed the bastard.
Yes.
Thank
you. Yes.
May it please your Lordship, let me deal with the pre-contract first of all, if I may, please. There is no doubt that if in fact there had been a pre-contract, it presented valid grounds for invalidating the marriage between Edward and Elizabeth Woodville,
If?
Yes. And it would provide valid grounds for passing over the prince's succession.
Not necessarily.
Yes, if it could be established.
Well, it would have been quite possible, in fact, for Parliament to have simply declared
That I appreciate.
He was a true king.
Parliament could, in fact, decide, although the levels of their, or the areas of their competence were not exactly defined by that time in medieval period that we're dealing with, subsequently it did, in fact, rule upon royal matrimony, did it not?
It ruled on certain issues of royal matrimony after the break with Rome.
Edward IV was a man who was a known philanderer, to use a polite term. Croyland reported him as indulging his passions and his desires too intemperately. Even Mancini said, with his access to inside information, that he was licentious in the extreme.
Yes, he was.
And so it was a claim which could be believed of Edward.
Not really. I think a licentious man like that is likely to get his way without having to make up this, to go through the business of a pre-contract.
This was a lady, the story went, who was resisting his blandishments, who would not succumb to him. It was said so keen was he to procure her that he even broke off a hunting trip, which he would not, Edward IV, ordinarily do.
That would have been the ultimate sacrifice.
Well,
It's a
the
good-
wild beast escaped on
Yes.
this occasion.
Several
Maybe in a
stories
good
like
cause.
that were told about Edward IV, in fact.
He did not attempt, after the death of Eleanor Butler, who died in a nunnery in, I think, Norwich.
I'm not
in
sure where he died. She died.
1468,
That's right.
to marry the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, in public.
No,
Right.
I don't think it's quite understandable that. After all, what we're supposed to understand is this is a highly secret. The whole
Precisely
thing is secret.
so.
Only Eleanor Butler and this Robert Stillington are supposed to have known. I'm not sure about you, Mr. Dillon, but I would probably, having gone through something like this with another lady, would have preferred to keep it quiet and not troubled my wife.
Exactly
with
so.
the details.
If he was to broadcast it, he would have been sowing seeds of discontent. There would have been a section of the public who would never have accepted whatever was said to have been the position. Would have been opening a can of worms.
But the thing, in fact, was a tissue of lies. This
Let's
is quite
understand.
clear. It's a tissue of lies.
Let's understand, if you please, because thereafter, Henry VII took great pains to suppress the story after 1485. Can I examine the evidence with you briefly?
What happened in 1485?
Yes.
Right.
Because it implied...
You say the pre-contract story is a tissue of lies.
Oh, yes, everyone believed it at the time. I mean, everyone knew it was a tissue of lies. They didn't believe the story.
Well, that depends
But
upon...
not apparently the Bishop of Stirling.
No, this bad, wicked bishop, as Commune called him.
Oh dear, we are getting into deep
I respectfully suggest that he's not a bad or a wicked bishop at all, and that it is necessary for one, if one's going to take a fair and balanced view, to examine the evidence which is available. I have not much time. May I try and examine some of it very quickly, please?
Well, as long as
In the Titulus Regius, which you pointed out to the jury, was the Act of Parliament confirming Richard's coronation, which referred to the illegitimacy and the reason for the illegitimacy. Upon Henry VII's accession, he ordered that all copies be destroyed under pain of heavy punishment, so that, and I quote, all things said and remembered in the said bill and act, therefore, may be forever out of remembrance and also forgot.
Yeah, so it was such a gross slander against his queen.
I am not criticising
Or libel,
his act.
I should say,
I
Your
am
Honour.
examining it with the jury, with your assistance. At the same time, the Justices of the Exchequer Division, that's to say, judges of the country appointed by the King, together with the Lords in Parliament, considered the Titulus Regius, considered the pre-contract, and came to the conclusion that the Bishop of Bath, that is, Bishop Stillington, made the bill. In other words, he was responsible for providing the information which gave the grounds for the bill which gave valid grounds, if they existed, for Richard to ascend the throne. Very well. The Lords intended to summon Stillington before them so that they could examine him. That would have provided a valid occasion, a proper occasion, upon which Stillington's claim in relation to the pre-contract could have been explored, whether satisfactorily or not, and from which one could have possibly learned whether, in fact, as you say, the pre-contract story was a tissue of lies, or was in fact the truth. Didn't it?
It's a very neat statement. The only problem, as I see it, is why, oh why, was this not done in June 1483? When it really mattered.
Because I'm asking about Henry VII, you'll understand. The examination did not take place because Henry VII refused, saying that he, the king, had pardoned Bishop Stillington. And yet, will you follow me? One of the first warrants issued after Bosworth and the victory there of Henry VII was to arrest the bishop, and the bishop was in fact arrested in York within 5 days of the Battle of Bosworth. It means, does it not, let me put this as low as I can, that on one view, Henry VII himself prevented, or at any rate avoided, investigation into the claim about the pre-contract? Does it not?
Carry on.
That's the question.
Well, what I think we've got to bear in mind about this is that Henry, I mean, you've thrown in so many different things, it's very difficult to know where to start.
I have stated to you a number of facts.
Yes, interpretations of the past, if I may say so. But in fact, I think we've got to bear in mind that Henry, in 1485, was endeavouring to start his reign on a fresh start, a clean slate. He wished to, as his early statements made absolutely clear, he wished to get all the old quarrels and disputes between his subjects forgotten and put behind. And I think this is a piece with this policy, to start straight away by saying, right, we won't go over all the stuff again. The fact is that no one believed it. He's passed an Act of Parliament which quite simply reversed it without discussing it in detail, married the Elizabeth of York, who became his queen, and then continued to start afresh. There was no need, in fact.
Well, I must go on to other matters, anxious though I would be to comment upon your answer.
Discuss it for a long time.
Neither Mancini nor Croyland identify Richard as being responsible for the deaths of the princes.
It's true, neither say directly he killed them.
Croyland simply says a rumour was spread that the sons of Edward had died a violent death, but it was uncertain how. In other passages in Croyland, and indeed in Mancini, they do not hesitate to point the finger at Richard, or whoever else they think might have been responsible.
What they do is they most clearly state that Richard III deposed his nephew, Edward V.
I'm not troubled
they remain
about...
silent on the question.
This trial is not directed to whether there was a usurpation, but whether there was a murder.
But a usurpation therefore gave the reason for a murder.
Well, we'll see about that in a moment or two with another witness, alas, much though I'm enjoying facing you across this courtroom. Let me come to the poem, if I may, please, because the word in the translation, which is a bit of Latin doggerel, the author not being identified at the end of this passage of the continuation of the Croyland Chronicle, reads, Richard III was not content therewith, namely Edward's fortune, carefully garnered during his years on the throne, but must destroy his brother's progeny. And as you have indicated, your understanding of that is bringing the ruin of, because the Latin word which is used is opprimerit. And the passage in fact reads, if everybody will forgive my mispronunciation, again, Nisi fratris opprimeret proles. Now, the verb opprimer can be used in the sense of putting down the cause of, or reducing to impotence or inactivity. Because what is being conveyed here is that Richard destroyed their inheritance. The children, the princes' inheritance. He destroyed their political, he destroyed their royal personality by his actions. It does not mean, or does at any rate not necessarily mean, that he murdered them.
Yes, that's a case that's been written in a very well worthwhile book recently.
What do you think is the case?
What do I think is the case? I think it depends. This word, I think, has several different possible meanings, and I think it's going to remain a matter of some dispute as to exactly what the author meant.
It's genuinely ambiguous.
It's a genuinely ambiguous word, yes.
Then two things only, in relation to Croyland and in relation to Mancini. One of our troubles is that all the chroniclers are Southerners, or, like Mancini, are reporting the Southern cause. There is not a single Northern chronicler. No. One of the things that marks the whole of this period is the fear of the South of the barbarians or aliens from the North, and the distrust of those from the North for those of the South. One of the things that one finds is the substantial prejudice running through Croyland, I respectfully suggest, of the Southerner about the Northerner. Can I read one passage to you? Lord, it's at page 509. If it's not included in the bundle which you have, during the adjournment I will ensure that you have it.
Thank you.
Referring to the period after Henry VII has ascended the throne, while visiting York...
What page is that?
509. Henry VII was visiting York, and there was an uprising while he was there. And the chronicler reports it in this way: although by these means peace was graciously restored, still the rage of some of the malignants was not averted. But immediately after Easter, a sedition was set on foot by these ingrates in the north, whence every evil takes its rise.
Yes.
Splendid stuff, isn't it?
Isn't it? And this even although the king was staying in those parts. I mean, the impertinent northerners, when the king is there, daring to rise.
Yes.
And that's a fair extract, because I can only use one.
That's very fair.
The other I'd like to simply ask you about, if I may, please, in relation to Mancini. As you've indicated, he obtained his information from a number of different sources, but clearly the Latin, Genoese merchants and so on, would be a fruitful one for him, particularly since he didn't speak English.
Not necessarily a lot of English. We don't know how much.
Little English. Never went out of London. No. Clearly was closer to the court of Edward IV. No contact with that of Richard III. Not even a physical description of Richard III. It's running throughout. Can I quote to you what another Italian said of the period, facing much the same sort of difficulties that Mancini did? I wish the country and the people were plunged deep in the sea because of their lack of stability, for I feel like one going to the torture when I write about them. No one ever hears twice alike about English affairs. It's almost an up-to-date report, I suppose. Yes.
This was another Italian.
That's another Italian.
Yes.
Another Italian spy.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Pollard. Dr. Starkey, please.
Thank you.
No, this is my last witness.
Thank you.
Dr. Starkey, is your Christian name David?
It is indeed, and Robert too.
And what are your qualifications?
I am a doctor of philosophy and history, an expert in the Tudor court, with an interest in the later 15th century.
You've been listening, I suppose, to the evidence to date. Did you hear what Dr. Pollard said about the pre-contract?
Yes, I agreed with everything that he said. It is clearly a concatenation of lies, rumour and absurdity, but we can go very much further. It is not merely a concatenation of absurdity, it is a red herring.
Why?
And was known to be because succession wipes out illegitimacy as every other obstacle to the throne. Edward, of course, had succeeded. He was king, absolutely.
On what basis?
By proclamation, by acceptance, by oaths of allegiance led by Richard himself, and by the execution of acts of state and the royal signature appended thereto.
So what you're saying, then, quite simply, is that the pre-contract doesn't arise because Edward V had acceded, and therefore, in law...
In the Sergeant Plowden, sir, if you wish exact citation in the 16th century, he describes accession as being like a very diamond, yea, the philosopher's stone, which wipeth out all blot. And we have indeed not merely the theory, the practice. Queen Elizabeth, of blessed memory, was bastardized in 1536. She nevertheless ascended the throne unchallenged in 1588 and never thought to wipe out that bastardy because the very act of her accession did it for her.
Yes, thank you. Well, now...
1558, the correction is most welcome, sir.
I hope to continue in the same vein, sir.
A little more Irish logic would help us, Mr. Dillon.
By whom was the proclamation to which you attach, no doubt rightly, such great importance
By the council,
made?
sir. By the council acting in its absolute capacity so to do. By the mayor of London. By Richard himself in the north and by every other authority in the country.
Thank you.
Again, do you agree with Dr. Pollard that Mancini and Croyland are the most reliable, contemporaneous chroniclers?
Absolutely so. They have perfect access to information and complement
I
each
only
other.
want to ask you one matter arising out of what they said, and that was the murder of Hastings, as referred to by Mancini, as we've heard. What interpretation do you place upon the reaction to the murder of Hastings?
It was a reaction that was intended to an act of unprecedented political terror. There is nothing in all the annals of the 15th century which parallels the conduct of Richard of York. A man is dragged actually from the cabinet table to instant execution. There is simply nothing like it. There are such executions after battle, as it were by the form of trial before the constable, but nothing like that. And it achieved the effect that was desired. Until that moment, everybody apart from Richard and Buckingham had tried to behave well. They had tried to follow the ordinary forms of law and decency. At that moment, the political nation is stampeded as Richard and Buckingham intended.
Well, now, may I come to what I really want to ask you about, Dr. Starkey, and that's the later chroniclers, Moore and Virgil.
I wouldn't call them chroniclers, sir, if I may correct you.
Please.
I would call them historians. This is the beginning of history, and it is something different.
Let's deal with Moore first. I think he wrote a history of Richard III in about 1513, so we're talking about 30 years after the event.
Yes, perhaps even finishing it as late as 50, or rather breaking off as late as 1521.
Did he ever finish
He
it?
never finished.
He never finished. It was broken off in 1521.
Yes. Tell us a little about Moore, quite shortly, please.
Moore is a lawyer, an intellectual, a politician, a figure of international reputation, friend of Erasmus, eventually canonized, Henry's Lord Chancellor, and the King's good servant, but God's first, in his own apt words.
Now, he tells the story of which I outlined in my opening.
Indeed, sir.
I don't think I need repeat it, but just in a sentence, that Richard III had first of all asked Brackenbury to do the deed. Brackenbury refused, and therefore Sir John Tyrrell was sent, and he arranged the two servants to smother and bury under the staircase and so on. It's been criticised more, Moore's version, I think, as an intellectual joke, a parody, leg pull, and obviously invented, and so on. Do you place any reliance upon the Moore version of these events?
Yes, the criticisms of Moore, on the whole, are very small minds attacking a very big one, which is not an unusual experience. If we actually look at Moore's account, it corresponds precisely and in absolute detail with everything that is known of the inner machinery of the royal household. we have then Brackenbury having refused the deed, Richard fuming as he sits, as More puts it, at the draught, namely on the privy. Now, this seems very extraordinary because he's actually talking to somebody at the same time, but in those days, as Montaigne said, the higher you were, the less privacy you had, even when you were sitting on the privy. The page is doing what any secret page, either at the court of Edward IV or Henry VIII, would have been expected to do. He is advising Richard. He says, outside there, beyond the lavatory door, there is lying on a pallet mattress the man, Sir James Tyrrell, who will do the deed for you. That is exactly what would have been happening. Tyrrell, as Knight of the Body, would have been on the pallet outside the chamber door. The exact procedure is there. This is to be taken seriously.
And so More discloses how, while the king was on the draught, the privy, that he spoke to his page, and the page suggested Sir John Tyrrell and so on, and he was brought in from outside and ordered to do the deed.
This is an exact parallel, as I said, to known court procedure in periods like my own, when we have better documentation, and also earlier ones like Edward IV, when the office of the groomship of the stool is beginning to emerge. That is, the king's lavatory attendant, who is becoming the head of the inner royal household.
You said this was the beginning of history as distinct from a chronicler, but in what manner did people write in those days? Because, again, More's embellishments and compensations and interpolated speeches and so on have been criticised as obviously having been invented.
I think we have to remember two things about how they wrote. Nowadays, when historians want to say that so-and-so existed in such a social context, they write, and I speak from experience, they write an unbelievably boring introduction about the social context of England when the man lived. Then you did it much more interestingly. You put it in his own mouth. You would input speeches there, and everybody knew there was this convention. There's no problem with it. Moreover, we as historians, not perhaps having the same hesitation about dealing with the past as certain lawyers, are able to distinguish truth from falsehood in these matters with very, very few problems. Secondly, I think we should point out that there is a different approach in terms of documentation. The beginning of history, these men were not writing with great piles of records, indexed nicely in front of them as we have now. They didn't have perpetual calendars as we do now. They got confused about dates because in those days, very often you didn't actually date a document by the day of the month and the year. You used a saint's day, and there were in any case 3 different years all going together.
Dr. Starkey, what you're saying, therefore,
difficulties.
It's difficult to get the facts right and
yes,
the dates right and so on.
Absolutely.
For somebody like More.
And mistakes are deeply somebody like More, writing under immense pressure, telling us in Utopia that he had to snatch time to write from between meals and even from sleep and even from the marriage bed.
You mean pressure of time?
Pressure of time, sir. And also grave difficulty of sources. For us, it's easy to be accurate. For them, it was very difficult. If I may say so, my lord, even lawyers at that time often got the dates of their statutes wrong because reference to the Rolls of Parliament was very difficult.
Can even happen today.
And I'm sure
I think the opening lines, to this part of the story, he uses the words, does More, hard that it be not true. And in the closing lines, and thus I have learned of them that much knew and had little cause to lie. Would More have written in that way if he didn't believe in the truth of his version?
No, sir.
It's suggested, I think, or has been suggested, it may well be suggested today, I know not, that this was biased Tudor propaganda. Does that accord with your view?
I think there are 3 very simple things to be said. Propaganda is always better if it's round a basis of truth. Everything that More says is to be paralleled in detail in works written before the Tudor period. And finally, if, as we so often do, or as the critics of More do say, we must not believe him because he makes certain mistakes, that would mean simply, sir, that we had no history, because with no man yet who did not make a mistake somewhere.
Was there any reason for More to have picked on an innocent Sir John Tyrrell and named him as a murderer in this account?
None whatsoever, nor an innocent Forrest, nor an innocent Dighton.
Then finally, just a word or two about the other historian, I won't use the word chronicler, the other historian at that time, Polydore Virgil. Again, he was an Italian, I think, but came to England in the early part of the 16th century, 1502, and was commissioned by Henry VII to write a history of England.
That is correct.
He gives an account very similar to More's, but in far less detail. I think one could, that would be a fair summary, would it?
It would.
It's said, of course, that the fact that he doesn't give the same detail as More underlines the fact that More's detail is wrong. Do you accord with that view?
No, I think it's of a piece with the rest of the arguments of people who say that sort of thing. They haven't even bothered to count the number of pages. Polydore Virgil's entire account of the whole reign of Richard is only 1/4 of the length of More's account of the first few months of it. Polydore Virgil is writing a gigantic history of England, going back to the days of Arthur to his own times. The reign of Richard III is an episode, so for artistic balance, you do not have the same amount of detail. It is as simple as that.
And finally, do we find, I think, in the Fabian Chronicles, that of the gentleman of the City of London who became Sheriff of London, does he report that it was common fame that Richard had the princes put to secret death?
He does indeed.
And I think the Chronicles of London, as they are known, the reference being the Vitellius part, does that record he also put to death the 2 children of King Edward, for which cause he lost the heart of the people?
It does indeed, sir.
Yes, thank you.
What are the dates of those approximately?
They're essentially reminiscences, sir, if I may, my lord, if I may interpolate. I do not necessarily put great reliance on them, but they certainly tell us what was happening in the city. They certainly tell us what men of some information, though not great, thought.
But they were written in the Tudor period.
They were written indeed in the Tudor period by men alive at the time, and perhaps coloured by what I'm sure will now be called Tudor propaganda.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
I thought I might say Tudor legend.
I'm sure you would, sir, yes.
Well, does that sound better to you?
No, it won't be the first time
you've
you've misused
better?
a word. No, it won't be the first time you've misused a word.
I dare say.
Nor the last.
Please help. Does it sound better?
No.
I see. Well, then, if this small lawyer's mind may I ask you some questions about the topics on which you have given evidence, Dr. Stacey?
Starkey.
You were led... I'm so sorry. I
Mr.
do apologise. I do apologise. I must ask one question about succession, though, to get that out of the way. I would respectfully accept everything that you have said about succession wiping out illegitimacy if you were to say that it was the anointing and the recognition ceremony within the coronation which would wipe out all past evils.
And I think you would be wrong.
May I finish the question?
No, sir, because I think it is founded on a completely false premise. I take it, therefore, that you do not recognise the succession of Edward VIII, who was not crowned. The role of coronation has never played the part that you're attributing.
I think if you allow counsel...
I will, sir. I'm sorry, my lord, I apologise.
I will pass on because time presses upon me, at any rate.
Facts, too.
Help me, please, about the Duke of Buckingham. I would be right in thinking, and indeed the jury can see for themselves from the little chart that has been drawn up, that the Duke of Buckingham had indeed himself a good claim to the throne.
A possible
one. He was directly descended through the Duke of Gloucester, Thomas of Woodstock, was he not?
Yes.
Could also claim descent from John of Gaunt, but can I leave that on one side entirely for the moment? In addition, in 1474, Buckingham had obtained the right to use the heraldic device of Woodstock, linking him directly to that descent. Buckingham was a very dark and shadowy figure, not a very attractive man, very well spoken, very plausible, with his eyes very much on the throne for himself. Do you agree with that?
It is, yes, I do.
Virgil reports of him, and I take this extract only as one, by way of an example, that the multitude said that the Duke did the less persuade Richard of Gloucester from usurping the throne by the means of so many mischievous deeds, with the intent that he, Richard, afterwards being hated both of God and man, might be expelled from the same, so that himself, Buckingham, called by the Commons to that dignity, whereunto he aspired by all means possible. And there are reports from More and from others of his...
Are we believing More at this point, sir?
No, I'm just asking the question, if I may, please.
If the statement has gone on so long, I'm now entirely unclear as to the question.
There are reports, are there not, from others as well, of his disliking Richard's gaining the crown rather than himself?
Retrospectively, yes.
Buckingham, of course, could not gain the throne if the princes remained alive. Can I establish with you some facts as to dates, please? The coronation took place on the 9th of July, 1483.
Unlike you, I have not, I'm afraid, refreshed my memory precisely.
Never mind, 6th of July, I am corrected from behind. Shortly after that date, Richard set out with his wife, the Queen, on a kind of royal progress through Windsor, Oxford, to Gloucester, where he arrived by the 29th of July and stayed till the 2nd of August. Is that right?
You are telling me.
I'm asking you
I'm
a
sorry,
question.
I do not have this information at my fingertips. Being a modern historian, I am used to using, as it were, little things in books as you did to put it together. Carry on.
Yes. Let's assume that I'm correct, if I may.
It's dangerous, but I will.
Very well, but then I won't trouble with the rest of that line of questioning. Let me just ask you something then, please, about More. We concentrate on Tyrrell, because it is said by More, who was a lawyer, as you pointed out, that Tyrrell, upon his accusation of treason, was examined and confessed in the manner above written, but whether the bodies were removed, they, because the passage refers to both Tyrrell and Dighton, could nothing tell.
He is using, I'm afraid, a paperback edition. The thing is here, yes.
I was using one that I've obtained from a library, published in 1883.
It's very out of date, I'm sorry. The standard edition is the one before me. Would you like to establish
Well,
a
it
paper
matters not.
reference?
What are the words that
I'm
you're
so sorry to use an
relying
edition
on?
which is out of date. Lord, the words are, Tyrrell and Dighton were examined and confessed in the manner above written, i.e. relating to the death of the princes, but whether the bodies were removed, they could nothing tell. On the following page, Moore recites that Dighton is still walking free. I forget the exact words, but he'll catch his just deserts in the end. Something to that effect.
True.
Walketh on alive.
I beg your pardon?
Walketh yet on alive.
Alive. But it finishes with, somebody will catch up with him in the end.
In good possibility that it be hanged ere he die.
Ere he die. Now that's written in 1513.
Probably 21, sir.
Or
If
later.
you'd used a more recent edition, you'd have seen that the likely terminal date is the execution of Buckingham's son in 1521, at which time More wrote a work which cites large passages of this
Well,
in a
then you
deeply
make my
serious
point
work.
even more valid. It's not, as I was thinking, 9 years after the time of the trial of Tyrrell for treason. It's even longer than that.
Certainly,
Possibly
yes.
as
Right into
much
the
as
1520s, certainly.
18 or 19 years after the trial for treason. But Dighton was never tried for treason.
Why should he have been? The
No.
treason on which Tyrrell was arraigned was not the treason of the murder of the princes
Can
in
you
the Tower.
confirm to me, please, that Dighton was not tried for treason?
There's no evidence of the fact. Nor
Exactly
Tyrrell
so.
was not tried on this issue, sir. Tyrrell was tried not on the grounds of that confession, but because of his alliance with the de la Poles.
Yes. I was
Therefore,
going
I'm
to-
afraid you're confusing the issue utterly and not for the first time.
Well, now,
Thank you so much, Mr. Starkey.
Dr.
I
Stark.
shan't ask. I'm so sorry, Dr. Starkey. I shan't ask any further questions.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Starkey. Well, as I indicated, that's my last witness, and therefore that is the case for the prosecution.
I think this would be a convenient moment for an adjournment. So the court will now stand adjourned.
Lordship pleases, members of the jury, it now falls for me to open the case on behalf of the defence. Really, we have one contention only to lay before you, namely that two views can be taken on every point that is raised by the prosecution. Those are honestly held views, and you'll hear them from the witnesses that I shall call. And in due course, I shall respectfully suggest to you that they are valid views. As I say, it's better that you hear those from them than from me. I'm going to call three witnesses in all. Lady Wedgwood, who is an art historian, who will show you how quickly, not Tudor propaganda or Tudor legend, but Tudor tradition, as it eventually became, painted in black and white only, Richard III, wholly black, and Henry VII, wholly white. How that was created in her field, how persuasively it was presented, and how persistently its echoes remain even to today. I shall then call an archivist to deal with the question of the pre-contract between Edward IV and Eleanor Butler. She will tell you that it is her view, despite what Dr. Pollard told us, that that raised a real issue then, and still indeed does today. Now, the third witness that I shall call is Mr. Potter, who is chairman of the Richard III Society, who will deal with Richard the man, presenting a rather different picture from that which was presented by the first of my friend's witnesses, who will explain why it was that Richard acted as he did, why it may have been, because we do not claim, our witnesses, to be versed with the answers to all questions at all. They will not speak anything like as positively as those who have been called by my friend. He will speak also of Buckingham, that rather dark, mysterious double dealer of the period. Because would you bear in mind, please, that you are considering a period only between April, in effect, and August of 1483, the whole of Richard's life prior to that time not in the company of Buckingham, and the whole of his life after that time not in the company of Buckingham. His behaviour is criticised only within that short space of time, while Buckingham too is upon the scene. Then I make it absolutely clear, so there's no misunderstanding from the start, that our case does not depend upon proving that Buckingham was the culprit. That's not the duty in any criminal trial, and will not be our duty here in this. What we simply say is that there is too little hard evidence to come to a firm conclusion, even on a balance of probabilities. That is to say, even twisting the scale and onus of proof which is required, degree of proof which is required in our courts, to match the circumstances that we face here, seeking to mount a trial some 500 years after the events themselves took place. Now, having said that, I'll go straight into calling the evidence, calling first of all Lady Wedgwood, please. Your Lordship has, I hope, and the jury has, I hope, as well, a bundle of, which is marked in a little brown envelope.
Yes.
Photos, packet 3, portraits. It's not very easy to get the contents out, but when you have, you will find on the top what appears in the photograph to be a line drawing, which this witness will be referring to.
Yeah.
Lady Wedgwood, you're a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, and principally apart from lecturing and writing extensively on your subject, which is that of an art historian, I think,
medieval art historian, yes.
specializing in the medieval period, was responsible for mounting the exhibition of Richard III in the National Portrait Gallery in 1973.
That is correct.
I think then did you assemble almost all the known portraits of Richard III, although curiously enough, even some more have come to light since then.
Indeed. I had note then of over 20, and the total is rising towards 30, and the others may yet emerge.
I think included in the exhibition were many letters and manuscripts, some in Richard III's own hand,
Yes,
and many artifacts of the period and of the personalities that we're concerned with.
indeed.
I would like to read to you, if I may, from my old edition of Sir Thomas More, his description of Richard III, which is passed down into posterity. Starting off by saying that he's less than Edward, who preceded him as king, goes on to say, little of stature, ill-featured of limbs, crook-backed, means hump-backed, his left shoulder much higher than his right, hard-favoured of visage, and such as in the States called warly. I'm not quite sure what warly means, but it's clearly not a compliment by the sound of it. Now, first of all, is that supported by the contemporary paintings or the contemporary accounts?
Little of stature, crook-backed and hard.
Ill-featured of limbs.
Ill-featured of limbs.
Moore goes on later to say he'd got a withered arm. Any truth in that?
There is no contemporary evidence that he had a withered arm from any visual sources. That he was considerably shorter than his brother, Edward, and of quite a different cast of feature could very well be demonstrated.
Crook-backed, hump-backed?
The first record of that is a written one, where it is accepted that there was some disparity in shoulders.
Ah, that's a different kettle of fish. Many of us have got one shoulder slightly higher than the other, or one slightly larger than the other, but hump-backed.
That is, I claim, an exaggeration.
Then can I ask you to look at the contemporary portraits? Is that the first that we have
The
in the bundle
genealogical
before the jury?
image, which you have, the black and white one, like this, is the one definite image of Richard made during his reign, almost certainly drawn by somebody who had seen him. And the figure in question is this one. That is the third in on the second row. This is the genealogical tree of his wife, Anne Neville.
The second that we've got is an enlargement of the three to which you have drawn attention, Richard being on the right-hand side, I think.
Indeed.
Again, any evidence there of deformity?
Certainly not. Nothing of the kind is conveyed, though the short face, perhaps, which is a contrast to his brother, could be
Then
pointed
I'm going
out.
to turn to number 3, which is a coloured print, and in fact a picture which is in the possession of your society.
The Society of Antiquaries.
Now, so far as is known, is that a faithful portrait of Richard as he appeared in life prior to his death on Bosworth Field?
It is completely compatible with the face you have already seen in the contemporary drawing. This painting, which suggests no deformity or exaggeration of any kind, is probably the earliest known copy of a lost original. It was in the past in the family until the 18th century. It shows no deformity and nothing special at all.
Well, then I'm going to go on to number 4, if I may. This is a portrait taken from the Royal Collection at Windsor. Is it possible to demonstrate that the right shoulder, in fact, has been lifted?
This is the case, Mr. Dillon. In fact, the last link of the chain of his collar is painted in a different hand, more clumsily than the other, and the uppermost part of the painting of his shoulder line is exaggerated. This is slightly cut. The picture should be wider. The point will be plainer if it were. There is a little bit of alteration there, which has made the point of a very definitely different shoulder. This one slopes down.
You mean by examination, by X-ray, you can show paint added at a different period?
Yes, the original shoulder line, my lord, runs there.
I see.
There's been a deliberate alteration
There
to
has
the
been.
right shoulder.
And it is also suggested that the eyes have been made more narrow.
The face looks to be a good deal more line, too, in this and subsequent portraits we're going to look at, than the original.
Indeed, he was only in his early 30s when he died.
31 at the time of the accession to the throne. Well, then, there's a group of others, because one passes on to copies of copies of copies, does one not? And the next 3, 4 that the jury have got in their bundle simply continue to reproduce the errors which one has seen, question mark, deliberate errors that one has seen in the one to which you have now drawn attention.
Indeed, they all depend from it. This is the Stafford collection, not before the 1550s. This one in the National Portrait Gallery, not before the 1590s. And this one, Duke of Northumberland, probably 1600, maybe 1620. And the last one, the Duke of Leeds, now at Montacute, 1600 to 1620 again.
Well, now, I need not dwell upon those because the point is the same.
It is.
It is the distorted image which has been copied. And I think there is an outstanding example which we have not got copies in our bundles, but which you have got.
Yes.
It's the portrait of Richard with a broken sword.
This is, you might say, an independent witness, evidently the same face, but clearly a propaganda picture.
Could you hold it for one moment so his lordship can see, and my friend?
Oh, yes.
There you will see he's holding a broken sword. That in itself suggests that it was clearly posthumous. But if you look at an image examining it, you will see that it has been altered in itself.
Now, what you're holding is now a black and white portrait.
This is the infrared photograph of it, where you can see there have been 2 alterations. It was originally painted with a very exaggerated left shoulder. This was...
Can I stop you there?
Yes.
Does that give the appearance of a humpback?
Indeed, sir. The other shoulder is somewhere down here.
It's been dropped.
Could you point it in my direction for one
Sorry,
moment?
my lord.
Oh, yes. Yes, I see. Thank you.
This very considerable exaggeration here, very low shoulder there.
Yes.
But that has been altered to make it more normal. It was originally painted, my lord, with a very deformed left arm, of which the cuff came to here, and the line went there.
Now, that's to give the appearance of the withered left arm.
Wearish.
Now, could you hold that round to point to the jury, please?
You will see
so that they can see
the
as
original
well.
line of the arm was there, right here, so that it was a sort of fraction of the proper length, but it was then altered to suggest a long arm to match this one, which would have been out of the picture. This picture has been in known hands since 1783, and therefore...
Well, I'm going to stop you.
Sorry.
Forgive me. But what I would like to ask is that when one thinks of, as one's bound to, I think, in this context, when one talks of Richard III, Sir Laurence Olivier's portrait of him, while that may be absolutely faithful to Shakespeare, is it a true reproduction of what Richard III himself was like?
I think one can say that it stands in the same relationship to the truth as the latest of those portraits does.
But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking glass, I that am rudely stamped, and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph, I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why, love forswore me in my mother's womb, and for I should not deal in her soft laws, she did corrupt frail nature with some bribe to shrimp mine arm up like a withered shrub, to heap an envious mountain on my back, to shape my legs of an unequal size, to disproportion me in every part, like to a chaos, or an unlicked bare freight that carries no impression like the dam. Why? I, in this weak piping time of peace, have no delight to pass away the time, unless to spy my shadow in the sun, and descant on mine own deformity.
Well, now, that kind of manipulation, and I use the word deliberately, is that also found in some of the written records about Richard III?
Undoubtedly.
Now, very briefly...
If these were manipulations, where would they be exhibited? Where would people see them, learn about them? Where would the propaganda effect be achieved? They were all in private collections, were they?
Well, my lord, the chief private collection in question was always the royal collection.
I see.
And the most important of these portraits, the one that was actually altered, was in the royal collection.
Yes, I see.
Well then, I'm going to deal with this without producing any more exhibits, but simply by way of two questions, if I may. Was one of the historians of the period a recorder for the Warwick family called John Rouse?
Yes.
Who wrote what is now known by experts in the field as the Rouse Roll.
Two Rouse rolls, in fact.
In the roll,
Yes.
which we can call the York one, that came into existence before the death of Richard III and was made during his reign, are there flattering references to Richard?
Indeed, there is a very extensive quotation. May I give you the words?
No, because I'm going to stop you, I'm afraid. Immediately Richard died on the field at Bosworth. What did Rouse do with that roll?
He had already said goodbye to it. It was, I am convinced, in royal hands. He, I'm sure, made it for the Queen. And he had, though, in his hands a second roll, which was in Latin, and this one he feverishly cut up to turn its coat. And it is that cutting up that is still plain. That one also survives. They are both extant. That one is in the College of Arms. He cut out the first image of Richard with his brother Edward and inserted an Edward III, which was safe.
In modern parlance, I'm going to interrupt, I'm afraid. In modern parlance, is this called editing?
Well, if you use scissors, yes, it is editing.
Thank you.
He doctored it, according to what you're saying.
Indeed.
Lady Wedgwood, I think only this. If we can just summarize your evidence about the portraits and see how relevant they are to the issue which this jury has to understand. It appears that after the event, Richard was made to appear more unattractive rather, than he had been portrayed previously.
Indeed.
And you have shown us that related to the raising or dropping of a shoulder and the narrowing of eyes.
Indeed.
That, with the very greatest of respect, that doesn't really help us to decide whether he killed the princes or not, does it?
I think if you can see that the manipulation of evidence is taken so far that a picture in the royal hands has to go, you might say, to the surgeon, then they are very determined to alter the material.
Yes, but it doesn't, again, with respect, it doesn't really answer my question, does it?
Well,
it doesn't help us, it doesn't help this jury to decide whether or not, at the end of July or beginning of August of 1483, that Richard instructed someone to murder the two boys in the Tower.
it is only contemporary evidence of his appearance.
And indeed, what those pictures show, in effect, is this, is it not? That those that were responsible for those alterations might have thought, and genuinely thought, that he was a murderer and a wicked man, and therefore portrayed him in an unattractive way. That's one answer, isn't it?
Indeed.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lady Wedgwood. Miss Sutton, please.
Thank you.
Miss Sutton, I think you're an archivist employed by one of the city companies.
I am.
Specialising in the records that you keep in the late 15th century, the period that the jury are particularly concerned with.
That's my personal interest, yes.
A fellow again of the Society of Antiquaries.
Yes.
I think the author jointly of a fairly monumental work, if you'll forgive me so describing it, on the coronation of Richard III.
Yes.
Editor of the Ricardian, which is a publication of the Richard III Society, I think.
Yes.
And has studied the question of the pre-contract. In particular, being familiar with a work which sounds very intimidating from Chicago University, Professor Helmholtz, entitled Marriage Litigation in Medieval England, which is published by the Cambridge University Press in 1975.
Yes.
Now, with your knowledge of the period, of Richard III and of the pre-contract, can I ask you two flat questions? It's been described, this question of the pre-contract, as being simply a pretext used by Richard to seize the throne for himself. Do you agree with that assessment?
No.
It's been described by one of the witnesses, and I hope I have the language right, as a red herring. In fact, do you agree with that?
No, it's the crux of the matter.
It is not known by anybody, despite all the researches, the date upon which Bishop Stillington might have mentioned the question of the pre-contracted marriage of Edward IV to Eleanor Butler.
No, we can only speculate on that.
But upon the basis that it was done as reported in Croyland, that this was a private marriage, clandestine, therefore not celebrated in public, not necessarily celebrated in church, not celebrated particularly importantly, I think, with the publication of bans, would that have been a valid ground for objecting to the validity of the marriage between Edward and Elizabeth Woodville subsequently?
Yes.
And inevitably leading then to the bastardization of the children?
Yes, the two things together.
Two things together. I need not ask you any of the detail about it, save I think this. Was adultery taken very seriously? In fact, in medieval times?
Oh, yes, it was a heinous crime.
When there was a question of succession or inheritance raised?
Yes, undoubtedly.
Then I'm going to go on to this question, please, as it suggested that Parliament was not a suitable place to pronounce upon it, as Parliament did in the Titulus Regius.
Parliament at that time did, in a sense, pronounce, or rather confirm or ratify, the individual king who was displacing another, that individual king's own personal claim to the throne, usually based in some way or other on the normal means of access to the throne. Parliament just agreed, fundamentally.
How far was Parliament a free Parliament in regard to its relationship with the King? Could the King dictate to Parliament? It wasn't the Parliament of 1984, was it?
It would accept, in this instance, what the King told it, yes.
Yes, thank you.
As indeed it had done with all the other
Yes.
kings who had displaced others in the 15th century.
Indeed, there was a petition from Parliament to Richard to take the crown prior to his coronation. Not Parliament as assembled, because not all the members were there.
The Three Estates, it was called.
Then the other matter I'd like to ask you about, if I may please, is simply this, relating to the pre-contract. It is said by Dr. Starkey that once proclamation had been made of Edward the Prince as King Edward V, then all questions of illegitimacy would have been wiped out. Do you agree with that view?
Well, I think it's true of Dr. Starkey's period, but he's forgetting the reign of Henry VIII and the great increase of the theory of the absolute king. So the situation is entirely different in 1483.
What, in your view, would have had to have happened for illegitimacy like this to have been wiped out? coronation itself?
Yes, the act of recognition, the act of anointing, and the act of coronation in that order.
Well, now, the act of recognition is when the Archbishop, having crowned, anointed, given the orb and the sceptre, I think, calls upon the lords assembled.
Yes, it in fact precedes all of the other, ceremonies.
Right. And is part of the coronation service which survives even to today.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Just stay there.
Miss Sutton, in relation to the pre-contract itself, that was done with indecent haste, wasn't it?
How do you mean?
Well, I mean this. Prince Richard was removed from sanctuary on the 16th of June upon the basis that he was going to attend his elder brother, the King's, coronation a few days later. Within 5 days of that, or 6 days, I think it was the 22nd of June, Dr. Shaw was preaching the bastardization of the princes from the pulpit at St. Paul's Cross.
What is indecently hurried about that?
Well, Miss Sutton, it came very quickly if at one moment the prince was to be crowned king, and the next moment, out of the blue, it said they are bastards upon the word of Bishop Stillington.
Yes, that's how it happened. I don't think I can argue with that, but
and because of the indecent hurry, it was accepted, and it did not go through the normal process of the courts, did it?
They didn't have an ecclesiastical court.
Precisely.
No.
And strictly speaking, I think I quote you from your evidence in chief, strictly speaking, that is what should have happened.
You could equally argue that an ecclesiastical court on the canonical legal evidence would have had to have found for Richard.
Well, you can argue that, but the whole point is, Miss Sutton, that the ecclesiastical court was never given the opportunity so to do. That's the fact, isn't it?
No, yes, you're into the realm of political expediency.
No,
now.
I'm not, with the greatest respect, into the realm of political expediency. I'm into the realm of the law. The law at that time said that the ecclesiastical court should have resolved the question as to whether or not there was a proved pre-contract, and that would have meant Stillington giving evidence and being examined upon it. And that never happened, did it?
No, not at that point.
What happened was that it was presented to the Lords at that time, the Lords not in Parliament, but the Lords in an assembly in London, to which they had come from various parts of the country for the coronation.
Yeah.
And it didn't come before Parliament until the following January, did it?
No.
And do you accept or not what Mancini said about this? And that was the only reason why the Lords accepted it, was because they'd seen what happened to Hastings, they'd seen the unholy alliance between Richard and Buckingham, they had realised that the multitude of troops from the north were at the gates of London, and they were frightened.
They were intimidated. Do you agree with that?
That's one way of looking at it, but it doesn't alter the fact that the pre-contract was a valid moral reason for Richard to take the throne.
If it was a valid pre-contract, but that begs the question, doesn't it, Miss Sutton? I'm suggesting to you that Dr. Pollard is right when he says the pre-contract was in fact a trumped-up pretext and trumped up in haste over a few days.
Yes, I don't believe it was trumped up.
You described it indeed as the crux of the matter.
Yes.
Why do you say that?
Because it gave Richard a genuine claim to the throne, a moral claim to the throne, as well as the political reasons to make him secure.
And the evidence of Stillington, and it was only upon the evidence of Stillington, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
Yes. It came at a very opportune moment, at the very time that he wanted an excuse to take the crown.
May I ask, how came it that Stillington took this upon himself to make this pronouncement?
He was a canon lawyer. He could make the connection between the fact of the pre-contract and the clandestine second marriage.
Miss Sutton, am I not right in saying that the suggestion was that Stillington had been the witness to the pre-contract?
There is that suggestion that
I'm not
could be
suggesting
so
it's
too.
necessarily true, but in answer to
No,
what his lordship says, I think there is a suggestion, I forget now where it comes, but that Stillington was the person who was the witness to the pre-contract, and only he and Eleanor Butler and Edward IV knew about it, and the other two parties, Eleanor and Edward IV, by then were dead.
That is found, yes.
So here was a one witness to say this about something which silence had been kept over a period of what, 15 years?
In canon law, you didn't need more than that, because you acted on the presumption of truth.
It might have been very suspect there. And indeed, as I suggest, it is.
If people generally accepted it to be true, that was more important than any evidence that could be presented in a court of law under canon law as they understood it.
But the
then.
difficulty was, of course, that people didn't generally believe it was true, and we get that from Mancini as well, don't we? The corrupt preachers and the colour for the usurpation from Croyland.
That's only one chronicler.
And Croyland, the colour of the usurpation, and Mancini makes it clear that the general belief at the time was that this was not a true contract.
Yes, it's still the words of two men.
Better than the word of one, Miss Sutton, Bishop Stillington. At all events, if we face this practically, did it really matter in any event? Because the fact that there may have been a pre-contract, the fact that the children may have been bastards, that could so easily have been reversed by Parliament, and indeed was.
It could have been.
But you see, Miss Sutton, this is the point. As I understand it, what is being said on the defendant's behalf is this. There was a pre-contract, it did bastardize the princes, therefore Richard had a true claim to the throne, and therefore he had no need to kill them. That's what
Exactly.
I understand the suggestion to be.
Exactly.
But the fact of the matter is, whether or not that was a valid pre-contract, he had every reason to have them disposed of, because Parliament at any time could have reversed that illegitimacy, as Henry VII did 2 years later when he came to the throne.
I don't agree.
Well, but why don't you agree? Parliament could have, and did.
Not while Richard was on the throne and
They-
in control of the princes.
But could have. He was not safe with the princes in the Tower just because they had been bastardized in the manner which we have heard described.
The pre-contract and their illegitimacy remains true, whether Parliament speaks or not.
Providing it has been properly proved.
Yes.
It's certainly, if the uprising in October, the Autumn Rebellion, was upon the basis, as it is suggested in the Chronicles, firstly upon the basis of freeing the princes, it clearly didn't seem to have very much effect on all those nobles of the south and Wales who supported that rebellion. They didn't seem to worry.
With great respect, I don't agree with the factual basis upon which Mr. Russell has made that suggestion. I'm sorry to intervene,
Yes,
but I cannot accept the factual basis that it's suggested in the Chronicles that the uprising in Wales and the south and so on was to free the princes. In fact, the uprising was to put Henry VII upon the throne, and that could only have been done if the princes, of course, were dead.
Well, I'm sorry, but Mr. Dillon is not right about that. May I quote from the Croyland Chronicle? Miss Sutton, I don't know whether you are aware of this or not. What is said in the Croyland Chronicle is this. In the meantime, and while these things were going on, the two sons of King Edward, before named, remained in the Tower of London, in the custody of certain persons appointed for that purpose. In order to deliver them from this captivity, the people of the southern and western parts of the kingdom began to murmur greatly and to form meetings and confederacies. That led to the Autumn Rebellion. And what I'm suggesting to you is that if that be right, that the rebellion started upon the basis of freeing the princes, well then all those nobles of the south, and it was the whole of the south of England, virtually, wasn't
That's
it?
a slight exaggeration.
Maybe it is. A lot of the south of England and Wales supported that rebellion to free the princes, whether or not they were bastards.
There were a lot of people involved in that rebellion who had their own personal axes to grind.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Miss Sutton. Then Mr. Pollard, please. Mr. Potter, it's Ronald Jeremy Potter. I think you're the chairman of a publishing group in London and chairman of the Richard III Society and have been since 1971.
Yes.
Published a number of works, included amongst which, published by a house other than your own, is the book I hold in my hand, from which my friend has in fact already quoted, Good King Richard.
Yes.
Well, now, can I turn to Richard straight away, please? I asked Mr. Richards about his character up to the death of Edward IV. How would you put it?
Well, I always put it that at the time when Edward IV died, Richard was a man of excellent character. He'd remained unswervingly loyal to his brother, unlike Clarence and Warwick during the long wars against Lancaster. He was the leader of the vanguard at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury. He was a courageous man. He'd spent 11 years as his brother's viceroy governing the north of England, where he had a reputation for just and fair administration. In fact, Mancini himself, whom we've heard was no Richard lover, said the good reputation of his private life and his public activities powerfully attracted the esteem of strangers. And he was 30 at this time. His record was unblemished. He was loyal, he was brave, he was pious, he was just, and he was the last man that anyone would have expected to have killed Edward IV's sons.
He had taken them into his care, in effect, during the time in London. Would that have had an effect upon Richard and his view of them?
After Edward IV died,
yes.
He behaved impeccably, of course, and the boys came under his protection. He, as has been stated, he led an act of public fealty in York. He did the same thing when he arrived in London. He led the Lords, he led the City Fathers in acts of fealty to his nephew. And throughout May, for 5 weeks, every act, everything that was done in the country was in the name of Edward V.
The late King Edward IV expressly put the children in the protection of Richard, did he not?
The realm, certainly, and with it the children, yes.
So he had a particular responsibility in respect of them.
Yes.
And in your view, discharged that obligation upon him?
I think he behaved impeccably. The reason why he has a bad reputation is that the Tudors had to say that he was being hypocritical and deceitful. If he behaved badly, they would have said, look how badly he behaved. Since he said he behaved very well, they said, he must be a hypocrite.
So his outward display didn't mirror his actual performance?
There is no reason to suppose that his motives were impure.
He had real reason, it's quite clear from the evidence which has been given already, to fear the South, was unpractised in the court, hardly came to London in the decade or so preceding 1483, I think.
Yes, I think it should be understood that the split between North and South at the end of the 15th century was somewhat similar, in fact rather greater than it is today. And people in the North were much poorer. They were regarded by the South as dangerous savages, and the real peculiarity of Richard III is that he is the only king of England who has come from the North with northern support, his northern affinity, to claim the throne. And this naturally upset Southerners, men of Edward's household, Edward IV's household, who lost their jobs to these intruding northerners, savages from places like Yorkshire.
Well then, real reason to fear a plot against him from the Woodvilles, who don't sound a very attractive lot.
Well, the Woodvilles made a preemptive strike for power, as I think is agreed, and this naturally put Richard on his mettle. And then it became clear, in my view, that the sensible thing was that Richard should become king. I mean, a boy king would have been a disaster. Nobody wanted a boy king. It would have started the Civil War over again. And the point about Richard's assumption was that his coronation was one of the best attended in history. Everyone actually, except the rival power groups, recognized that it was the sensible and logical thing. If Richard remained as pretender, he was open in 2 or 3 years' time to the vengeance of the Woodvilles. And not only Richard himself, but everyone who had supported him, all his affinity.
How much importance then do you attach to the evidence given, if that's the right way to describe it, by Bishop Stillington about the pre-contract?
Well, I think Stillington probably was right. I mean, Stillington was a man of considerable importance. He'd been Chancellor of England for 7 years under Edward IV, which was the #1 job in the country, equivalent to Prime Minister today. And so Stillington was very far from being a nobody. Certainly, his evidence at this time was very convenient.
He was Lord Chancellor at the time?
He was Chancellor under Edward IV, not at the time. He had fallen out with Edward IV and been imprisoned at the time of Clarence's disgrace.
Yes.
And some historians assume that the reason for his disgrace was that Stillington told Clarence some years earlier of this pre-contract, which would have made Clarence the heir to the throne and not the boys, and that was the reason for Clarence's execution.
Clarence, just remind us, is the gentleman who is said to have died in a butt of Malmsey, I think.
Yes, Clarence was the brother who stood between Edward IV and Richard, and if he had been alive, would have had a better claim than Richard. And perhaps I should also make this point, that he had a son alive who was called Edward, Earl of Warwick, and this was another nephew of Richard's, and his claim to the throne was better than Richard's, except that he was disbarred by Clarence's attainder. And this was a nephew of Richard's in precisely the same position as the princes. Attainders were readily reversible. Edward of Warwick, Parliament could have reversed Edward of Warwick's attainder, and that would have given him a better claim to the throne than Richard. And what happened to Edward of Warwick, we happen to know. He was well treated by Richard. He was kept up in Yorkshire in a royal nursery with Edward IV's daughters, and he was even made Richard's heir at one time. He survived Richard's reign quite happily, and of course, immediately after Bosworth, he was put in the Tower of London by Henry Tudor and judicially murdered some years later. So we do know what happened to one nephew who had a very good claim to the throne, as good as the two princes, once they'd been declared illegitimate.
Well then, what do you say about the pressure, inevitable pressure, as the prosecution like to describe it, upon Richard to kill the princes, because if they stayed alive, those nephews, they were a threat to Richard?
Of course, they were some kind of a threat to him, but when he was the crowned and anointed king, he was home and dry on the 6th of July, 1483, when everybody accepts that the boys were still alive. You see, the overseas chronicles, the French, there is the assumption that he had to kill the boys in order to become king. But he didn't. He became king while the boys were still alive. And it was in Richard's interest, in my view, to keep the boys alive. They were much more of an embarrassment to Henry Tudor and to Buckingham if Buckingham was aiming to the throne.
Well,
and it is hypocritical of Henry Tudor to shed tears over the boys. If Henry Tudor had beaten Richard, he would have had to have killed the boys. Otherwise, he would not have been accepted as king.
Because they stood in his way?
Yes.
But the same is true of Buckingham. So let us concentrate for a moment, if we may, upon Buckingham. He had a good and direct title, as we can see from the little chart that the jury have already got. We know that he'd got his eyes on the crown, because the chroniclers tell us, and that's been agreed in cross-examination. Can I follow the chronology immediately after the coronation, please? Because Richard and the Queen left London first, leaving Buckingham behind. Am I right in thinking that it wasn't until Richard and the Queen reached Gloucester, where they were between the 29th of July and the 2nd of August, that Buckingham joined them there, stayed for a short time, and then went straight on to Brecon to his estates in Wales. That's the order of events, I think.
Yes.
At Brecon at that time was Bishop Morton detained. That is the man who later became Archbishop of England and in whose household More was brought up. The chroniclers describe Buckingham and Morton's conversation, and indeed it's right to say, even in the old-fashioned edition that I've got of More, the More history of Richard breaks off during their conversation, which began soon after, according to More, who might have known about this fact at any rate, soon after Buckingham arrived there.
Yes, I mean, may I say something about Buckingham's not being with Richard on the royal progress? Buckingham had the opportunity at that point to kill the princes. Yes. He was the Constable of England. Brackenbury, who was the Lieutenant of the Tower, could not have denied him entry. There were many stories going on for many years about what had happened to the princes, and Buckingham is mentioned in 4 or 5 chronicles as a possible murderer. Now, I wouldn't want to accuse Buckingham of the murder any more than I want anyone to accuse Richard of it. It was certainly a highly plausible thing. There were other stories about what happened to the princes, that they were smuggled abroad, which is even said by Polydore Virgil. They were going on for years. Of course, there were rumours that the boys had been killed at the time, but Henry Tudor, when he became king, was just as much plagued by rumours that the boys were alive as Richard had been plagued by rumours that they were dead.
He had to face Lambert Simnel,
Perkin Warbeck. Perkin Warbeck was accepted as the younger prince by most of the states of Europe. The King of Scotland gave him his cousin to marry.
But then can I come back to the conversation between Buckingham and Morton? Because Buckingham is, virtually speaking, hot foot from London. Was the conversation between those two, as reported by the chronicles, let us start an uprising to free the princes, or was it, let us start an uprising to put Henry Tudor on the throne?
Well, the idea that Buckingham wanted to see Henry Tudor on the throne is, I think, a total illusion. Buckingham was going for the throne himself.
It would have been a tremendous step for Buckingham to take, would it not? Richard still being alive, just being crowned, for him suddenly, apparently without the knowledge of King Richard, according to your theory, to have killed the princes.
Buckingham was the impresario, the stage manager of Richard's accession to the throne.
That may be.
And he probably saw himself as a Warwick the Kingmaker. And Warwick the Kingmaker, of course, changed sides when the particular king didn't suit him.
Well, so can I come on to the events subsequently? Because in the February-March 1484, the Queen released the daughters, including Elizabeth, whom Henry Tudor had undertaken to marry by then, into the power of Richard. What's your view about that?
Well, if the Woodvilles thought that Richard had killed the boys, their behaviour really becomes quite inexplicable. Not only does Elizabeth Woodville, the boy's mother, release all the girls into Richard's power, she sends for her son Dorset, by a previous marriage, to come home, to leave Henry Tudor and come and join Richard. And then later on, of course, she and Elizabeth York, her younger daughter, plan a marriage with Richard, and there is a surviving reference to a letter from Elizabeth York, the boy's sister, saying that she is Richard's in heart and in body and in soul. And the idea that she would have written those sort of things about someone who'd murdered her brothers is, I think, unthinkable.
Well, then I'm going to ask about 5 other very short matters. Once Henry VII had defeated Richard at Bosworth and assumed the throne himself, is there any evidence that he made any kind of inquiry about the prince's death?
Henry?
Yes.
I mean, one of the extraordinary things to me is that there is no direct contemporary accusation of Richard as the murderer of the princes. Now, Henry Tudor's Act of Attainder against Richard III, when he became king as Henry VII, mentions the phrase, the shedding of infants' blood, which obviously refers to the princes. But it is a general accusation, and what Henry Tudor needed at that moment was two little bodies and a requiem mass, and bury the princes, bury any thought of pretenders. He never produced them. He never produced a story of what had happened to the princes. To back up this vague charge, it took him 17 years for a framed confession by Tyrrell, who had remained as captain of one of the castles guarding Calais for 17 years, serving Henry Tudor. He was lured onto a battleship in Calais harbour under promise of a safe conduct. He was put in the Tower and he was executed for treason, conspiring with the current Yorkist pretender,
Now, I'm going to stop
Suffolk.
you, if I may, please. Is there any record to be found of that confession anywhere?
There is no record at all. It was not publicised by Henry Tudor. We only know of it from Moore. It was despised by Henry Tudor's official historian, Polydore Virgil.
One of the matters that Mr. Russell referred to in opening was Richard's silence, that he never produced the bodies, never produced the children, never denied or made any statement about them himself. What do you say about that?
Well, there could have been a number of reasons for that.
Yes.
One of them might have been that he despised the rumours, that it was beneath him to take any notice of them. Another might have been that he thought that he would confuse his enemies more if they didn't know whether the boys were alive and dead. And in particular, he wouldn't wish to display them so that people wouldn't know their whereabouts. If Buckingham had killed the princes, of course, he didn't have them to display.
Given his role and his protection of them, would any denial that he made have been acceptable?
No, his enemies, of course, wouldn't have believed him. And I think even deeper than that, if Buckingham had killed them while they were under Richard's protection, he would have felt extremely guilty. I mean, he would have felt responsible for their deaths. They were under his protection and someone had killed them.
Thank you very much indeed.
Mr. Potter, I think we can agree probably on the first matter I'm going to put to you. The Woodvilles set about a preemptive strike for power. Those, I think, are your words. That resulted in Richard being summoned by Hastings from the north.
Yes.
Result of that, Rivers and Grey, two of the leaders of the Woodville faction, with the Prince at Stony Stratford, arrested. Subsequently to be executed, almost certainly without trial.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that, actually. There is a
I
reference...
use my words carefully, almost certainly without trial.
Quite possibly with a trial, but under the... presided over by the Earl of Northumberland, as stated in one of the chronicles.
But very much a barrack room trial over a very short space of time, if it took place at all. Yes. And
Killing without trial was not an unusual event in these days, I gather.
No, it became commoner when the Tudors were on the throne.
Well...
That's a good tu quoque, if I may say so.
It was also against the desire of the council, the royal council, wasn't it, who had specifically refused to ratify their execution.
Well, what happened was...
Well, that's right, isn't it? Firstly...
yes. May I state the grounds on
No,
this?
Mr. Potter, first of all, please, just answer the question. That is correct, isn't
Initially, yes.
Oh, yes, initially. Thereafter, Richard ordered their execution without further reference to the council.
Did he?
I'm suggesting to you that's what happened.
No, I'm suggesting that is quite wrong. I'm suggesting that the council, the later council, did authorise their execution. There's no reason to suppose that Richard ordered it
Is there
himself.
any evidence of that?
There's no evidence that he acted individually.
Is there any evidence that the council authorised it?
There is no evidence that they didn't.
Is there any evidence that they did?
No.
Thank you.
That there wouldn't be.
The result was that the result that followed from that was that Richard clearly then set about the crown.
I don't think those two facts are connected, no.
Richard set about for the crown at some stage, did he not?
Yes.
And do you accept, which is again is suggested directly by the chroniclers, that Hastings, having had his views on that, asked for by Buckingham, made it absolutely clear that he would have no truck with that suggestion?
I would suggest that Richard aimed for the crown as a result of Hastings' conspiracy to kill him.
Now, why should Hastings possibly wish to conspire to kill Richard when Hastings was accepting and summonsing Richard to protect Richard's protectorship?
Because Buckingham, as you've just mentioned, I think, and is mentioned in the Chronicles, sounded Hastings out as to whether he would accept Richard as king.
Precisely. And Hastings said no.
Yes.
And the result of that was that Hastings was dealt with by way of trick, arrest, and immediate execution.
Hastings was plotting against Richard's life.
There is no evidence of any sort to support that proposition, is there?
Can I mention 3 pieces of evidence?
Yes, please.
The first of all, the letter that Richard wrote to York, that there was a plot against his life. Secondly...
By the Woodvilles.
Secondly...
By the Woodvilles.
Hastings had allied himself to the Woodvilles.
Hastings was totally anti-Woodville, Mr. Potter.
I'm sorry.
Well, do you disagree with the evidence of Mr. Richards about that?
No, I don't. The whole point was that Hastings swung back to the Woodvilles because his nose had been put out of joint by Buckingham.
Where's the evidence of that?
Hastings, that is in the situation.
In the what?
In the situation.
No, where is the evidence that Hastings swung back to Woodville?
We are both speculating, are we not?
Well, I'm not speculating because I at least have the backing of Mancini.
Yeah.
Mancini...
Can I say something about Mancini?
Well, in a minute, Mr. Potter, but perhaps we ought to move on a little. The fact of the matter is that Hastings was dealt with in a way which shocked, horrified, and appalled. Still does.
As a result of a plot. And that College of Arms document clearly states that there was a Hastings plot, and that dates from the 1480s. It's much earlier.
Prince Richard was got out of sanctuary by a trick and lies, correct?
No, I wouldn't say that at all.
Prince Richard was got out of sanctuary on the pretext that he was required for his brother's coronation.
According to whom?
According to Mancini.
Yes. Well, I wouldn't trust Mancini on that point.
Why not?
I mean, Mancini's source was Edwardian loyalists. Mancini did not speak English in the view of his editor. He had a very limited view. He was an honest reporter, as I have said.
Yes.
But he had a very limited view. He never got involved on Richard's side. He doesn't seem to have spoken to anyone putting that point of view. He was against Richard. He was against the Woodvilles.
Well,
his information came from people who thought the same way as Hastings. So he would naturally say that Hastings' plot was an invention of Richard's. That would be quite natural for him to say. But we don't have to believe him.
No, but the trouble is, Mr. Potter, that wherever the chroniclers, such as Mancini and Croyland, say something detrimental to Richard, then the pro-Ricardians then say unreliable, don't they?
Well, that's a statement with which I don't agree, and it is played, if it is played, it is played the other way just as much.
How do you think the prince's mother was persuaded to allow the prince to be taken out of the safe sanctuary of the Abbey?
Because she trusted Richard, I would say. You see, the tower was the right place for the boy to be. It was a royal palace. His brother presumably wanted company, and that was the right place for him to be.
It was the wrong place for him to be, because he didn't stay there for very long, did he? He ended up under the staircase, Mr. Potter.
Well, according to you, I'm doubtful about those bones, I'm sorry to have to say. I mean, the sex, the century is not known.
Mr. Potter, again, this is the trouble. The Ricardians had a good run until the early 1930s, and then Mancini was discovered in the library at Lille, his record, and then the bones were discovered the following year. And both of them were a bitter blow to those who had been supporting Richard, weren't they?
No, the bones don't prove, even if the bones are genuine, they don't prove that Richard killed the boys.
No, but they prove that they were killed in the Tower.
If they are true, they do. It is likely that they were killed in the Tower, but it is not certain.
And there is no way, is there, Mr. Potter, that they could have been killed in the Tower by anyone without Richard at least knowing about it.
He would have known about it afterwards, but not necessarily at the time. And can I point out that if you are going to kill people in the Tower and get rid of their bodies, you do not bury them very deeply in the ground. There is a very easily available exit, which is the Watergate.
They weren't discovered for 200 years, and then only by mistake.
Other bodies were discovered and decided that they were the princes. There were bodies discovered in 1647 as well as 1674.
If you accept, Mr. Potter, if you accept, as I think you did a moment or two ago, that if someone had killed the princes in the Tower, then Richard must have known, well, then he remained silent, did he not?
That is true.
For the whole of the rest of his life, not for very long, for 2 years or so.
That is true.
He never sought to find out who had killed them and accused that person?
If it was Buckingham...
No, don't just worry about Buckingham at the moment. Anybody, whoever had killed those princes, and I suggest no one could possibly have got into the Tower with Brackenbury the keeper holding the keys and killed those princes without Richard knowing within the time it took a horse rider to get from London to wherever Richard was.
Constable of England could certainly have got in the King's absence.
Not without Brackenbury the keeper knowing.
No, quite
right.
But that does not mean that Richard knew at the time.
No,
it means that he would have known afterwards.
Within a few days?
Yes,
of course, yes, I accept that.
And Brackenbury was an ally and friend of the king, was he not?
Exactly. He would have told the king instantly.
There could be no possible reason for Richard, with the rumours that were flying around and his insecure position on the throne, there was no possible reason for him to remain silent or not inquired from Brackenbury as to who had done this dreadful deed and accused them.
If he knew that somebody had done it, he could well have chosen to keep quiet. Because, as I said earlier, his enemies would have blamed him, he may have felt guilty himself, he may have wished to keep his enemies guessing as to whether the boys were still alive. It was important that Henry Tudor shouldn't know whether they were alive or dead. There are plenty of reasons why he wouldn't have said it.
But in reality, the only possible reason for him keeping quiet was because he knew perfectly well that it could only be to his detriment because he must have been a party to it.
No, I don't accept that.
Finally, let me ask one further question on the bones.
Lord,
it would have been a very remarkable coincidence if it happened that two other children of about this age were both found in a box in non-consecrated ground in the Tower. But you say, no, they weren't the princes. It's a very strange coincidence.
There were two other bodies discovered some 30 years earlier.
Of children?
Of children. There was another one which was subsequently discovered to be one of the Tower apes. But the date, the dates of the bodies are not known. They could be Roman, the skeletons. I mean, we're going through hundreds of years, possibly. All that we know is that the bones are pre-1674. Yeah. And the Tower was a well-inhabited building throughout the Middle Ages.
Mr. Potter, of course, I mean, you have to say that, don't you? You cannot accept that those bones are almost certainly, I don't put it anyhow on that, almost certainly the bones of the princes, because it blows a lot of the Ricardian argument sky high, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
Let me ask you about one or two questions.
It only blows sky high those who thought that Henry Tudor had done it, which is a position that I have never occupied, and which, as far as I know, very few people suggest now.
No, I think that's right.
That was the whole point about it. It was said that it had altered the date, so they had to have been killed in 83. And Henry Tudor
I must leave that topic, Mr. Potter, because I have to ask you about two other things. I want to ask you a question about Buckingham and then about the release of the daughters from the sanctuary. Let's assume, for the purposes of these questions, that Buckingham did in fact, or was a major party to the killing of the princes. Because if Richard is responsible, Buckingham almost certainly was. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'm deeply suspicious of Buckingham,
yes.
I would say that, yes.
Well, now, and let's assume that he had a motive of his own. Perhaps he saw them as getting rid of them as a way to the crown for himself in due course.
And also blackening Richard's name, yes.
Yes, but that's a very weak argument, isn't it, Mr. Potter?
No, I don't think it
you're
is, of
not
course.
seriously suggesting that Buckingham would go into the Tower and murder those two boys in order to be able to let it be mooted abroad that Richard might have done it and so blacken his name. You're not really suggesting that.
Plus clearing his own way for the throne. The double.
As his lordship was saying to you, it's almost inconceivable, isn't it? It would have been a tremendous step for Buckingham to take to have done this, if I may use the expression, off his own bat.
Buckingham was a very unstable character, so I think is generally agreed.
Is there any evidence at all, anywhere, from anybody, to suggest that Buckingham had done that murder on his own?
Well, it depends how you read some of the chronicles. I mean, the College of Arms one says that the boys were killed
on the vice.
On the vice. And,
Yeah,
and you
but
can
that
either
means-
say that's on the advice, or you can say it's by the device of.
But
If
that's
it was
not
by-
evidence that he did it on his own.
Yeah, if you read it as device, which is just as good,
Yes.
and Buckingham and Richard is not mentioned, it is a possible indication that Buckingham did it on his own.
Yes. Well, now, you have been saying that Buckingham had lots of opportunity because he stayed in London after the coronation. Any evidence to support that?
Yes, the king went to Oxford
For a
and
dinner at Magdalen College. And Buckingham wasn't on the guest list. That was 10 days or so after the coronation. I forget the precise date. But it doesn't mean to say Buckingham was in London, does it?
No.
No. Well, that's what
but I think it is said that Buckingham joined Richard at Gloucester
on the
from London. Because he went on to Brecon there.
No, with respect, not from London. He next turns up in Gloucester, I think on the 29th of July, and goes on to Brecon.
Well, let's accept it.
All I want to establish is a lot of your questions in answer to my learned friend have been upon the basis that Buckingham stayed behind in London, and all I'm suggesting to you is there's not a shred of evidence to support that.
It is a presumption that if he wasn't at Oxford, that he wasn't on the Royal Progress, and that he would have stayed in London. It is a presumption for which there is no evidence.
And if Buckingham had done it, there was absolutely no reason for Richard not to accuse him, at least at the time of his execution for treason after the rebellion in October.
Well, I think there is, and I've stated those reasons before. It is very significant that after the meeting at Gloucester, it was then that Buckingham went off to Brecon and joined the other side. And my interpretation of that is that the quarrel between Buckingham and Richard was over the murder of the princes. They never met again. Richard called him the most untrue creature living and refused to meet him before his execution at Salisbury.
And that was the moment and the opportunity for him to say, Buckingham, you are a murderer, arrest him, try him, and execute him before he had a chance to join the rebellion which was then mounting itself.
Buckingham was far too powerful to be arrested immediately at short notice.
Hastings had been disposed of within half an hour.
Hastings was in London, where Richard had the power. Gloucester was in the West Country, where Buckingham had his power base.
And finally, Mr. Potter, Elizabeth, how should we describe her? She was a pretty tough lady, wasn't she? Not a very popular lady. She was in this position, wasn't she? There she was with her 5 daughters, been in Westminster Abbey, in the sanctuary there, for, I think, in the abbot's house she was she not? In the abbot's house for 9 months or so, or getting on for a year. Sanctuary wasn't all that safe in any event, was it? I mean, they could have been removed at any time.
Yes, I mean
it
was unlikely, but there
there's
were
precedent
possibilities.
for that. I mean, sanctuary had been broken by force on other occasions.
Well, not, I think, where women were involved. It was, again, it was the Tudors that killed women, but not the Plantagenets.
There was little prospect at that time of any challenge to Richard, was there not?
No.
she was really faced with this situation. She either stayed there and let her daughters grow up for another year or two in sanctuary, or she accepted the offer which was made by Richard. And the offer was a fairly handsome one, wasn't it? He gave many pledges as to what he would do with the daughters, as to their safety and marrying them off and so on.
Yes.
Yes. So she had Richard's assurance. She really had no alternative but to let those girls out, and Richard didn't really care about the women in the family, did he?
Henry Tudor had said that he would marry Elizabeth of York. He'd sworn on the high altar at Wren Cathedral the previous Christmas. He had got the support of the dissident Yorkists by saying that she was most important to Richard.
Now, that is the point, is it not? That autumn rebellion, which maybe it started to free the princes, maybe it started in some other way, but it ended up with Yorkists changing camp and supporting a Tudor claimant, a Lancastrian claimant to the throne in the person of Henry Tudor.
These were southerners who had been deprived of their estates by Richard's northerners.
And
this was a north-south
They were
argument.
southerners, and they were pro-Edward IV and Edward V loyalists to a man.
Well, you say to a man, I mean, there were a handful of them. Most people didn't leave the south of England for Brittany.
But the rebellion went through, what, 7 counties?
A very small number of people involved, easily put down.
Well, it was easily put down because there was very few troops, in fact, around them. And Henry Tudor, on his way over the Channel, hit a storm, and the 2,000 men he was bringing over never got there.
A very small number of people in the south of England. It was widespread.
The reason why Yorkists espoused their cause and supported a Lancastrian on the throne, or possibly on the throne, in the person of Henry Tudor, was because they were so appalled at Richard's treatment of the princes.
The Croyland Chronicler specifically says that they were concerned about the plantation of northerners in the south.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Potter.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Potter. Thank you very much, Mr. Potter. Then that is the evidence that I call. Right.
Then do you address the jury?
Lord, yes.
For the prosecution, Mr. Russell?
It will only take a very few minutes, members of the jury. But the fact is, and you may think, and I suggest that you should, that this is being conclusively proved, is that these young boys were killed and buried secretly in the Tower, where they had been incarcerated by their uncle, this defendant, when he seized the throne. And, members of the jury, this just could not have happened without Richard knowing about it and condoning it. Everything Richard did points to his guilt, and nothing specifically, other than assumption, points to his innocence. Members of the jury, that is, in a sentence, why we suggest that he is probably guilty of this murder. And I use that word probably advisedly, because as his lordship told you at the commencement of this trial, that is the onus which is upon the prosecution to prove, to satisfy you in the special circumstances in this case of the guilt of this defendant. Of course, the evidence is circumstantial and largely hearsay. It has to be. Well, where do we start? We start with the bones. That the anatomists and the historical facts particularly that the princes, those two boys, were in the Tower at that time, and people had said they were killed, and people had said that they were buried in the place where those bones were found, makes the coincidence too great, you may think, certainly on the balance of probabilities, too great not to be those of the princes, despite what Mr. Potter may still try to persuade you to the contrary. Who had the motive? Well, answer primarily, if not solely, Richard. And the events underline that motive. The power of the Woodvilles, the fear of the Woodvilles, the takeover bid by the Woodvilles, which brings Richard hurrying south at Hastings' requirement. And what does he do? He sets about destroying that powerful faction, the Woodvilles. The two heirs to the throne are held in the Tower. There's no question, is there, but that Richard, the younger of the two, was removed from sanctuary by deceit and by deception on the pretext, this being the 16th of June, on the pretext that he was required to attend his brother's coronation. It is very clear that by this stage, members of the jury, you may think that Richard already was setting out to obtain the crown for himself, because within 5 days, the question of the bastardization is being shouted from the pulpit of St. Paul's. Who stood in his way? Hastings. Because Hastings said no when Buckingham attempted to find out whether Hastings would agree. And what happened to Hastings? Well, I needn't repeat it. You have heard. Asked to come to a council which was split, a half meeting in the Tower, he's arrested and executed immediately without trial. Well, members of the jury, what was he going to do about the boys? Well, at the first stage was to declare them illegitimate. And that he did in a way which you have heard from the witnesses, and I need not repeat. The witnesses for the prosecution have said clearly a pretext. And the fact that they'd been bastardized really didn't matter, because if that happened, the next claimant to the throne, or the protector on behalf of Edward V, if he was ever put back there, would have got his parliament to reverse the bastardization in exactly the same way as Henry VII did when he finally defeated Richard after the Battle of Bosworth. And therefore, they still were a danger, and you may think, therefore, had to be destroyed. And destroyed they were. Rumour and record at the time, and afterwards, condemn Richard. Mancini, from the small excerpts to which you have had referred, obviously thought that he'd done it, but effectively says, reading between the lines, well, it doesn't surprise me because of the ruthless disposal of Hastings. Croyland, no positive evidence, the careful insider historian, but finds it difficult to remain silent altogether and introduces it at least in those verses. Philippe Comines, the Frenchman, says it categorically. And the other Frenchman, the French Chancellor, makes that public and damning statement. But from Richard, answer comes there not. Silence, a silence resonant in its significance. Well, members of the jury, do we really need the Tudor historians, I won't call them chroniclers, the Tudor historians at all, More and Virgil? It's for you to say how much reliance can be placed upon More. Is it the work of an intellectual joker to which no regard should be paid at all? Excuse me. Or is it, as Mr. Starkey said, for the reasons which he gave, a record to accept in outline, if not in detail? Is no relevance at all to be placed upon Polydore Virgil, who gives the More version but in less detail, simply because he was commissioned by a Tudor king to write a history of England? And there are the other later records about which you heard. Well, Mr. Jerry, you're not being asked to say that you are satisfied, so that you are certain that he did. You're only being asked to say that he probably did it. And in the end, as I've said, it comes to this. The princes disappeared. There were rumours that they were killed, which turned out to be true, you may think, beyond any doubt at all. Richard must have known that they were killed. And either he had ordered it, or he would have been told about it. Brackenbury, the keeper of the tower, put there by Richard, a friend of Richard's. There is no way that anybody, Buckingham or anybody else, could have entered that tower and killed those boys without Brackenbury, the keeper, knowing. And Richard would have been the first person to know after that. But what did he do? Absolutely nothing. And that can only mean, we would suggest, as you've heard from Mr. Pollard and from Mr. Richards, that can only mean that he ordered those executions, because otherwise he must have accused the wrongdoer to clear himself. And it's no good saying, we suggest, that, well, it could have been somebody else like Buckingham, and Richard couldn't do anything about it for fear he wouldn't be believed. He would have been no worse off, and certainly probably very much better off, to have taken the action of accusation and denial. Now, Mr. Jerry, there it is. There's really only one question that you've got to ask yourself. Has it been shown to our satisfaction that King Richard probably ordered the deaths of the princes? If the answer is yes, then he is guilty, and we would respectfully submit that that verdict is well founded upon the evidence which you have heard.
Yes, Mr. Dillon. May it please your lordship, I too, members of the jury, will be short. You've heard the whole of the evidence which we have been able to compress into this very short period of time, and it will have given you a view. Whether you feel that it can possibly have given you a complete view, let alone a complete understanding of the complex problem that you're called upon to consider, may be a very different kettle of fish. Particularly bearing in mind that although we're examining it here in the year 1984, we cannot any of us possibly know what the year 1985 or 6 or 7 may add to our knowledge and understanding of the events that we examine. We've got to examine these facts as far as we can dispassionately, being very careful about over-emphatic and over-positive assertions. Whether you criticize any of my witnesses for being over-positive will be a matter, of course, for your good judgment. You may think that Dr. Pollard was somewhat over-positive on the pre-contract, and Dr. Starkey over-positive on just about everything. And so let's be careful, shall we? Knowing that the subject is one which is coloured by emotion and has been distorted by outrages of this kind, and the depiction of Richard III, but this is, I say, not in any critical sense of a great actor, you will understand, but that which is imprinted upon all our memories, I think, Sir Laurence Olivier, in Shakespeare's Richard III. Let's therefore look at Richard before the death of Edward IV, because one cannot ignore the reputation that he had. He's criticised by Mr. Richards for having acquired or disposed of some land previously belonging to the Warwicks. The carving of great estates was almost a pastime of the rich man during that period, quite apart from other events. He's described as being a man of piety, a man of unswerving loyalty to his brother Edward IV, refusing to divert himself from selfless service for his brother and his brother's family, despite, for instance, the treason of Clarence against his brother. Let's examine the commentators upon whom my friend relies. Comines, the Frenchman, I'm not here to denigrate all Frenchmen, it will be understood, particularly in today's climate. Comines, please remember, had perhaps that engaging unreliability which one attaches to the French sometimes. In one part of his history, saying it was Richard who slew the children, and in another part, the Duke of Buckingham. Does that advance our knowledge, that gentleman living at a distance anyway from our shore, quite apart from the other considerations which one would have? Then take the two, because I will leave more till last, upon whom my friend does rely, particularly Mancini and Croyland. The prejudice exhibited by Croyland is well enough summarized. Mr. Richards was kind enough to agree with me in that very short passage. There are many others which I read from the continuation for which the unknown author was responsible. The north whence every evil takes its rise. Is Croyland, with that immense prejudice, to be relied upon? Very well, then let me remind you that this man, at the centre of affairs, does not say Richard slew those children. Rumour has it that they were put to death, but no one knows how. I paraphrase slightly, but not inaccurately. Where is the support, then, that Richard was guilty of the crime of murder from Croyland? Then let's turn to Mancini, described by the witnesses as an Italian spy with not good English. Let us accept that that is so. With access, obviously, not to Richard's court, as I think it was Dr. Pollard made clear for us. Some access to Edward's, clearly, but access to the southern view, not to the northern. And our investigation is bedeviled, as Dr. Pollard agreed, in this sense that we have nobody upon whom we are able to rely, save a few scattered remnants of Richard's own letters. There is no northern chronicler to put the other view. Does Moore put the other view? Not on your life. Moore was a boy of 4 years of age at the time of Bosworth. What kind of reliable account can he give then of those events all those years before, save a hearsay one, drawn from those forces who were triumphant, the Tudor ones, and who, so soon as Henry Tudor had conquered at Bosworth, like John Rouse, were busy with paste, scissors, and water, stitching history together again in the way that they wanted it to be read. We lack information, quite clearly, and that will be as obvious to you as it is to us this side of the court. We lack, alas, positive, concrete information even about the bones. It is appalling to think that we have to learn from Dr. Ross that Professor Wright's examination in 1933, upon which historians relied so completely until 1955, when Professor Ross made his own inquiries about it, is inaccurate, for there is in truth no blood upon the jaw of the elder child, and even if there were, it does not support medically the conclusion that that child was suffocated. Was Professor Wright so misled by the old traditional account of Moore to distort that view, which should have been a purely scientific one? Bear that in mind, then, when I talked to you about Buckingham, Mr. Potter made it absolutely clear, I hope to you, that he is not giving evidence in saying that Buckingham did it. But consider these facts and ask yourselves whether it is not perfectly possible that Buckingham did in fact take the step which, whether it assisted Richard or not, most certainly would have advanced his own claim to the throne. He had that good claim, provided the princes were out of the way. He coveted the throne, and he had the opportunity to, as Constable of England, that senior position, to get into the Tower, if not himself, then through agents employed by himself, to kill the princes. Why was it, can I pose for you the question, that there was no inquiry as to the fate of the princes when Henry VII had ascended the throne? Bear with me, would you, for one moment. If Henry wished to complete the devastation of Richard as a political figure, as a memory in people's mind, if he wished to secure himself against pretenders, show himself to be the avenger of the death of those children, then the first thing that he would have done would be to go to the Tower and make inquiry. The evidence is, and we can only act upon such evidence as is available, that he did nothing of the kind. Is that because, if he had done so, he would have revealed either perhaps that Buckingham was solely responsible, or Buckingham was jointly responsible for bringing about the death of those princes? If he established that, then he would have made a bid for the throne of England in conjunction, in the abortive rising late in 83, in conjunction with the man who had put to death the two princes who stood in his, Henry VII's, way to the throne. And that he could not afford to do, for it would not have made his position upon the throne more secure. And so he avoided it. Why is it, you will ask yourself, that the Queen released the daughters, albeit the pressure upon her that Mr. Russell has referred to? But she not only released the daughters, she released the eldest daughter, who was a walking threat to Richard because of the promise of marriage made by Henry VII at the high altar at Rennes at Christmas 83. And not only did she release the daughters, but she sent for her son Dorset to put him too into the hands and at the mercy of the man whom she knew or believed had murdered her two children, Edward and Richard? Or was it that she knew and believed, or believed, that in fact it was Buckingham who had taken that step, or some person other than Richard? One other matter can I refer you to in relation to the pre-contract. There's nothing that small-minded lawyers enjoy more than anything else, is having a good old fight about a knotty problem, about a pre-contract or something of that kind. And my only friend Mr. Russell and I, with the assistance of my lord, could have spent some hours going into the to's and fro's and the pros and cons of this question. I suggest to you, for your consideration, that Miss Sutton's view is a totally valid one, because it is supported by one really quite remarkable and outstanding fact. And that is that while complaint is made, in particular by Dr. Pollard, that no examination was made of Bishop Stillington in public about the existence of the pre-contract, the man who had the opportunity of making that examination frustrated the judges of the Exchequer and the lords in Parliament who had resolved that such an examination of Stillington should take place. The man who prevented that was Henry VII. Why did he do that? If that had revealed, of course, that the two princes, Edward and Richard, were in fact bastards, it would have revealed also that his wife, Elizabeth, was illegitimate. And that would not have assisted the security of his seat upon the throne of England. And so there are layers and layers and layers which have got to be stripped from these facts before one can in fact get down to drawing fundamentally important conclusions about the facts which you have examined. Richard's silence can be attributed, certainly in the way that my learned friend Mr. Russell has attributed it, to the complicity of Richard, but that is not the only view. Richard would know perfectly well, such was the climate in England at that time, that for him to deny simply the murder of the princes would not have been acceptable to half the audience to whom he was speaking. So better to remain silent, as he did. It is not one of those facts that one can take hold of, as one can a book or a pen, and say, I have this, I see it, I know it, it proves itself. And there is in the examination that you've got to make here, no one fact which can perform that task for you. For the basic premise of the prosecution case is this: the princes were a threat. They were in line for the throne, and therefore he had to kill them. There was another nephew who was equally a threat, if the princes were in fact a threat, who was nurtured and harboured by Richard as lovingly as if he was his own son, who so tragically died in the spring of 1484. Does that not, on its own, quite apart from those other elements that I have referred to, show you quite clearly that even upon the balance of probabilities, one cannot grasp firmly to say Richard is guilty. We can't prove that he is not, but that is not our task, as my lord will tell you, for it must be, under our system, the case that the prosecution proves to your satisfaction that Richard is guilty. I thank you for your attention deeply.
Members of the jury, at the beginning of these proceedings, it seems a very long time ago now, I venture to say that what you, as the sole judges of the facts, are concerned with today is an endeavour to pass a historical judgment on King Richard III as to whether or not he murdered or caused to be murdered the princes in the Tower. It's a grave allegation, and that the fact that the king is dead does not make it less grave so far as his reputation is concerned. Calumnies against the dead, false accusations against the dead, even in a historical inquest, there should not be. On the other hand, if guilt can be established, and it is for the prosecution to establish it, as Mr. Dillon has pointed out to you, it is not for the defense to establish the king's innocence, but if the guilt is established, then it is right that at the bar of history that judgment should stand, for a duty is owed also to the dead princes, is it not? It was the great historian Lord Acton who said, history is a judgment seat. For the purposes of these proceedings, if when you consider your verdict, you can conclude and can say, we think it's more probable that King Richard did murder the princes than not, then a verdict of guilty would be right. If, on the other hand, the probabilities point the other way, or you think that the probabilities are equal, maybe one thing or the other, then your verdict should be one of not guilty. You will not forget that you're considering an allegation of murder. The more serious the allegation, the higher the degree of probability that is required. Now, members of the jury, I'm not going to review the whole of the evidence. You've heard it and you've been listening carefully to it. The time is late, and I don't know that I can take the matter very much further to assist you, so that I now invite you to retire to consider your verdict. There are two verdicts open to you, either a verdict of guilty or a verdict of not guilty. If you find yourselves unable to reach unanimity about your verdict, then I will be prepared to accept a majority verdict. And I hope that is clear to you. So will you now please be good enough to retire to consider your verdict. Thank you.
The court will rise. Have you reached a verdict on which you are all agreed?
Yes.
Do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Members of the jury, if I may address you for the last time, your verdict will, I suspect, your verdict of not guilty in respect of the charge that King Richard III murdered the princes, will probably stimulate rather than end the controversy that has surrounded the deaths of the young princes. King Richard III has not been allowed to rest in peace. You may think that the controversy about him will continue as long as interest in our island history continues, and long may that continue. Thank you very much.